Galactic Origins of by Edward Wellen. Here are 8 connected short stories, each of which was originally published between 1952 and 1962 in Galaxy magazine, which referred to them in the table of contents as non-fact articles. 3 of these were republished in an anthology called All About the Future in 1955. One appeared in the science fiction crime and detective Megapack in 2017, and one appeared in a collection of the author's stories entitled The 28th Golden Age of Science Fiction Megapack, Edward Wellen, Volume 2, in 2015. Read by Darrell T. Smith II for my channel, Quasar Spectra. Origins of Galactic Slang. AD. To delay asking a question until it becomes unanswerable. O.T. Zweifel, 4217 to 4259 Unified Era, a Terran physicist, remains the only being in the galaxy believed to have journeyed into the past. On 203 Day, 4259, Zweifel's assistants helped him don the entropical helmet he had devised. With this helmet, he attuned himself to an artifact found in the ruins of Rome. Forthwith, Zweifel was transported from his laboratory in New Zealand to a square in ancient Rome. Apparently frightened by the apparition, a noonday crowd of toga-clad Romans hurriedly dispersed. One man alone stood his ground. Zweifel, already beginning to suffer from the temporal stress that sapped his energy, staggered to the arch beside which the man stood. Fighting off waves of pain with all the power of his will, Zweifel inquired in Latin, "What year is this?" The man, quite unperturbed, responded that it was 124 A.D. On the verge of blacking out, Zweifel snapped himself back to his own era. But as he dictated the account of his brief excursion, there began the awesome physical transformation which seemingly characterizes travel into the past, and which has militated against the desire to repeat Zweifel's experiment. Drained of life potential, Zweifel's body stiffened into a petrified pillar. However, before complete immobilization set in, Zweifel managed to voice this question: "How was he able to answer me in modern English?" F.E.G. An expression of hostility from an unsuspected source. The letters F.E.G. signify for emotional gratification. The first F.E.G. was activated by the Venusian roboticist Cor Leo, 2289 to 2370 UE. One day, in 2314, his son, aged 4 years Terran, wandered into Cor's home workshop. The usually mild technician was joyously delivering a savage kick to the posterior of his superior, the chief roboticist. Becoming aware of his child's presence, Cor colored a deeper peppermint and coiled his leg back in its normal position. He hastily informed his son that this chief roboticist was not the real one. It was the first experimental model of an F.E.G. The F.E.G., a roboticized replica of a hated individual, was to be a psychic safety valve, a harmless outlet for emotions repressed because of danger of reprisal. Cor explained that the use of the F.E.G. differed from that to which witch doctors once put wax dolls. Unlike the witch doctor's suggestible victims, the original would not know that his enemy was subjecting his image to indignities. Cor smiled at his son and wondered if the child understood. His son smiled back. It was the warm, coaxing smile that always turned each of Cor's hearts over. "Please, Daddy," the child said, "make me one of you." Hickey's Mistake. An act with serious consequences, paradoxically the result of the very knowledge that such an act has such serious consequences. George Matthew Hickey, 2743 to 2765 Unified Era, was a Terran archaeologist. It was on a field trip to planet 32b 796 that he made the error which has perpetuated his name. Hickey seems to have been quite inexperienced. Records indicate that he arrived with only 6 weeks' supplies, although he intended to stay 3 months. However, that was not Hickey's mistake, for there was always the practical possibility of living off the land. Besides, as later events proved, Hickey required only 2 weeks' supplies. At that time, the natives of planet 32b 796 had a culture similar to that of Earth's Middle Paleolithic man. This fact caused Hickey's study of the daily life of the natives to be brief, inasmuch as the routine was a simple struggle for survival. Hickey soon turned his attention to uncovering a burial mound. That, however, was not Hickey's mistake, for the natives permitted outsiders to intrude in exchange for some of the gaudier products of galactic civilization. In the opened graves, Hickey found tools buried with the dead. Middle Paleolithic man had also buried tools with the dead. This excited Hickey. It apparently proved the existence of a rigid pattern of development for humanoid life. However, that was not Hickey's mistake, although the subsequent work of Steiner had shattered that theory. Hickey's notes end here, but we may reconstruct what followed. Hickey used gestures to question the natives. He asked if they currently buried tools with their dead. They shook their heads, yet the burials had been fairly recent. Hickey, therefore, rashly accused the natives of lying. That was not Hickey's mistake, however, for the natives who had gathered about him took the accusation in good spirit. They found humor in the outsider's inability to see what was so plain to them. They managed to explain to Hickey that they did not bury the tools with the dead. It was indeed the reverse. When someone accidentally broke or destroyed a tool, it was the tool they buried. Their custom was to entomb the tool breaker with the tool. This revelation stirred Hickey deeply, so deeply that, in his eagerness to record it, he bore down too heavily on his pen and broke it. That was Hickey's mistake. Hasilgni. A message which contains more information than the sender realizes, yet less than the receiver requires. On 23 Day, 2416 Unified Era, the row-butler of Professor Ian Heath, born 2351, found his employer dead in the laboratory of the professor's London, Terra, home. The body lay beside a small pile of ashes and a large heap of battered machinery. 2 objects had fallen from the professor's grasp, a vial of poison and a note. This is what the note says. I am taking my own life. It is because the discovery that ought to have proved the prime achievement of my career has turned out to be my supreme failure. I am sorry that in my first reaction I destroyed the machine and my formulae. I should have allowed them to stand, to perpetuate Heath's folly. My purpose was to construct a device that would set up an implosion vortex. I believed that such an effect would twist matter out of the matrix of our universe and into a different form of existence. Looking back, it seems foolish that I should have chosen to begin the experiment with myself as guinea pig. But I was eager to experience another state of being, however fleeting, and my formulae indicated a safety margin. So I started the machine, set the implosion vortex for a duration of 1,000th of a second Terran, and stepped into its focus. I waited. Nothing happened. I felt no change, no sensation whatever. I stepped out. My machine hummed most impressively. I had rechecked my formulae countless times. The only error, therefore, was my premise of an implosion vortex. And so I bid the universe farewell. Perhaps I shall experience another state of being after all. Or is the belief only another Heath's folly? The above note is on exhibition at London Museum. It faces a mirror so visitors may read it more easily. Manny. To alter the perspective of past events. Laborious research has traced this term back to the first recorded empirical proof of the coexistence of space-time continua. On October 12, 1954, at approximately 7 minutes past 4 p.m., there occurred the temporal and spatial displacement of the newsstand located at the northwest corner of 57th Street and Madison Avenue in New York City, Terra. Manny Freeman, the proprietor and operator of the newsstand, being within the newsstand at the time, perforce accompanied it upon its journey. Extracts from a transcription of Manny's own words follow. "Whoosh! I feel myself getting dizzy. I hear a customer holler, 'Hey, hold on, how about my change?' And then 57th and Madison is gone, and me in the stand is setting in a kind of courtyard. I seen 4 or 5 big things, but it was like they was made out of smoke." A question directed at himself took shape in his head. "Why has your world spewed you hither?" Manny sensed that the question really emanated from one of the forms confronting him. "Look," Manny said, "I didn't ask to come here. All I know is 1 minute I'm selling papers, next minute it's like I'm dreaming. I gotta get back. Look, I just got in a pile of extras." He picked up a paper and showed them the headline, "Giants Massacre Yanks." Manny describes himself as becoming somewhat agitated. "Hey," he said, "that's impossible. The Yanks was leading the Giants 12-4 at the end of the 6th. Then there was a lot of excitement, and they called the game for some reason. A bunch of customers come over right then, so I didn't catch the reason." Manny recalls that at this point he seemed to hear voices conversing in his brain. He speaks truth. This means that there is a temporal cancer which will spread unless we immediately restore maximum probability. That is all Manny can tell us of the parallel continuum. Again, his senses reeled. At about 7 1/4 minutes past 4, the newsstand reappeared in its normal location, and Manny gave the indignant customer his rightful change. And approximately 1 hour earlier, at Yankee Stadium, several gigantic forms suddenly materialized and loomed menacingly above the Yankee dugout. Toting aspic to Terra, engaging in an unprofitable venture. This phrase derives from the circumstance that Professor Argus Bentley, 1961 to 1989, 1988 Nobel Prize winner in chemistry, independently provided the solution to Terra's pressing food problem. On March 11, 1987, while ostensibly on a fishing cruise off Key West, Professor Bentley surreptitiously jettisoned a weighted parcel. On March 17th, the British superliner Queen Alexandria logged a sluggish transatlantic crossing of 22 hours, 18 minutes. Investigation exonerated the Irish chief engineer. A multitude of evidence pointed to one staggering conclusion. The oceans were gelling into a firm, viscous mass. Further investigation verified that the land areas of Terra were surrounded by highly nutritious aspic. On March 25th, Professor Bentley dramatically revealed to the world that this historic transformation had been brought about by his genius and initiative. He revealed that he had set off a self-sustaining colloidal process, initially involving thermite, ocean pressure, and a catalyst which he had discovered. On April 1st, Professor Bentley was appointed American member of the Aspic Trusteeship Commission of the United Nations. The ATC successfully engineered the diversion of rivers into mid-continental reservoirs, licensed aspic mining operations, and supervised distribution of aspic. On June 16, 1989, Professor Bentley was one of 14 persons fatally injured in the Le Havre when a bomb exploded during ceremonies honoring him. The murderer, who was never apprehended, was suspected of being a chief who objected to the manner in which France was garnishing its coastal aspic. Zazzling, embracing eagerly, but without feelings of ardent affection. Fen Zaslin, 3660 to 3772, was a Calistan biologist. In 3695, he married a beautiful young Martian. Despite his marked display of possessive jealousy, their relationship seems to have been a happy one the first 4 years. In 3699, Zaslin was drafted for a 2-year tour of duty aboard a Solar Expeditionary Service vessel. Early in the morning of the day of departure, Zaslin's wife awoke suddenly, startled by a labial sensation. She discovered Zaslin in the act of applying a salve to her lips. With an admixture of embarrassment and defiance, he explained that he had developed a repellent that would make it impossible for her lips to meet those of another being. Zaslin's wife laughed affectionately at what she termed his lovable foolishness and attempted to brush his cheek with her lips. To her surprise, she found her lips curling back, away from his flesh. Good-naturedly, she substituted a fond farewell hug for a kiss. Zaslin departed, promising that upon his return he would coat his lips with a nullifying agent so that he might, like the Prince Charming of the Terran myth, awaken his sleeping beauty with a kiss. Zaslin's wife was on hand when the SES vessel returned. Sighting his familiar figure descending the ramp, she eagerly jostled her way through the welcoming crowd and ran toward him. She clung to him and pressed her lips tightly to his. Finally, she broke away and released a heartfelt sigh. Then she administered a resounding slap to Zaslin's face, automatically divorcing him, and rushed to the spaceport restaurant. There she ended 2 years of enforced vegetarianism by devouring a thick, juicy steak. Origins of Galactic Law. Principle of self-punishment. Provided the court concurs, any person pleading guilty to a crime may choose the punishment he deems fitting. People v. Kilgore, 3380, 84 UN 793. Paul Kilgore was a Terran pilot who was scheduled to make the first solo hop in a faster-than-light craft from Pluto to Alpha Centauri. Celebrating the coming event at the Universal Joint, a spaceman's hangout on Mars, he met a former shipmate. He testified at his trial after a nebulous number of Venus vapor cocktails, he agreed to drop his friend off at Pluto. Kilgore said that while they were passing through the asteroid belt between Mars and Jupiter, he discovered that the flap of the kit attached to his uniform was open. Anxiously, he felt in the pocket. It was empty. His Doppler pills, compounded especially for his projected flight, were missing. He testified that he searched the entire ship and failed to find the pills. Then, with growing suspicion and rage, he looked at his snoring passenger. He shook the limp figure of his friend and angrily asked if the latter had swallowed the pills. The friend made no answer except a foolish grin. Kilgore claimed that this was too much for him. Vengefully, he jammed his friend into a spacesuit and dumped him on one of the 50,000 or more mile-thick asteroids. Each pill, Kilgore testified, would hold up metabolism across 130 light years. Long before the drug wore off, Kilgore said he believed someone would come across his sleeping friend. Still fuming, Kilgore returned to Mars for a new supply of the pills. His first stop was the Universal Joint. He testified that the bartender seemed glad to see him and handed him a small pillbox. The bartender said that Kilgore had dropped it there. When it came time for the judge to pronounce sentence, Kilgore asked to be allowed to impose his own punishment. The judge was surprised, but he heard Kilgore out. And he sanctioned the penalty, a harsher penalty than he had intended to impose. Kilgore spent the remainder of his life hunting the sleeping body of the man he had marooned on one of the myriad asteroids. Psychic guilt. Fitting the punishment to the criminal supersedes fitting the punishment to the crime. People v. Nika, 3286, 70 UN 1245. In the lobby of the Jovian hostel at which he was staying, born Nika, a Sagittarian, brushed against another guest, an Antarian. The Antarian, being unused to the gravity of Jupiter, fell and bruised himself considerably. When he had struggled up again, however, instead of rebuking Nika for jostling him and not offering to assist him to his feet, he passed the incident off lightly. He was about to hop on his way again when Nika, in an insane rage, felled him with a blow. This time the fall was fatal. Nika, instead of trying to escape, waited expectantly beside the body until a nickel led him off to detention. Note: by 2012 UE, inflation had caused nickel to replace copper as the designation for an officer of the law. There he remained, happily awaiting trial until word reached him that the widow of the Antarian he had murdered harbored no hatred for him, and had indeed forgiven him. Infuriated, Nika broke out of his cell, located the widow, and killed her too. Again he waited beside the body of his victim. And again, he not only did not resist arrest, but seemed to welcome it. Smiling, he pleaded guilty to both murders and listened eagerly for the verdict. But the judge deferred passing sentence until sociologists could go into Nika's background for a clue to his seemingly illogical actions. They found that Nika's society had stabilized itself on a mass psychosis. Because of atrocities his people had committed in their history, they had piled up a vast unpaid debt of guilt. This weighed so heavily on them that every normal individual in Nika's society had a compulsion to seek punishment. The judge studied this report. He reasoned that the greatest punishment Nika could receive would be no punishment. Any penalty he could impose would only gratify Nika instead of punishing him. Therefore, he set Nika free. Frantic, Nika appealed the court's judgment, but in vain. The Galactic Tribunal held that he could not place himself in double jeopardy. The Jovians deported Nika to his home planet. There he remained an outcast because of his humiliating failure to obtain the punishment they all sought. His honor was not restored until he bribed a passing Cygnian to shoot him in a carefully contrived hunting accident. Pro rata sentencing. Terms of penal servitude are to be based upon comparative life expectancy. People v. Gund, 3286, 70 UN 1245. In the park on the vacation satellite orbiting around Altair 7 was the body of a vegan, beaten to death. Beside him lay the carcass of his pet Ululu, also beaten to death. Erdo Gund, a Procyon, voluntarily gave himself up. At his trial, Gund's deposition, which he had signed by impressing his noseprint, was offered in evidence by the prosecutor. In this deposition, Gund admitted killing the pet's master, but not the pet. In fact, he stated, his motive for killing the master was the anger he felt when he saw the vegan brutally beating the pet. He struck the vegan down when the cumulative effect of witnessing nearly 2 hours of the master's cruelty and the pet's pain had proved unbearable. At this point, the judge interrupted the reading of the deposition. He said he had understood other witnesses to state that the vegan's fatal beating of the Ululu had lasted only 10 minutes at most. The prosecutor said that his honor was correct in his understanding. But, he said, the deposition was accurate too. He explained to the judge that, to the Terran-type observer, the Procyon's span of life averaged 2 Earth years. In that length of time, the Procyon lived, subjectively, as long as a centenarian Earthman. The prosecutor further said that in view of all the circumstances, He was of the opinion that Gund could not plead not guilty by reason of temporary insanity. However, added the prosecutor, he would ask His Honor to be lenient and take into account the temporal differential. The judge followed the prosecutor's recommendation and sentenced Gund to 30 earth hours of psychic guilt. Semantic jurisprudence. That branch of the law which systematizes forensic debate on questions of meaning. U of Venus versus Vac Inc. et al., 2937, 63 UN 8451. Vac Inc. was a Terran corporation supplying the vacuum of space for use in laboratory research. At its plant on Luna, it manufactured its product by welding two duralloy hemispheres lip to lip and thus sealing a vacuum inside the globe they formed. One container in a shipment to the University of Venus proved to be defective. The university sued for damages resulting from sudden failure of the built-in valve. These damages included the tearing of the elbow beard of a visiting Ganymedian professor, which had been sucked into the globe. Attorney for the defendants asked for dismissal of the suit on the grounds that a vacuum was nothing, and that when both parties to the action had stipulated the loss of a vacuum, the plaintiff in effect admitted losing nothing. In support of this contention, attorney for the defendants exhibited the advertising slogan of Vac Inc., "Nothing but the best." Attorney for the plaintiff countered the dismissal motion by stating that if this were true, then the defendants were confessing to the inequity of giving nothing in exchange for good hard cash. However, attorney for the plaintiff argued no absolute vacuum exists in all space, there being a minimum of 12 molecules per cubic foot in the emptiest reaches. Therefore, she claimed, there is nothing in the universe which one might name nothing. That last statement, attorney for the defendants replied scornfully, was self-contradictory. "Nothing exists," he said. "The space between the molecules is nothing." Quickly, attorney for the plaintiff exclaimed that now her learned opponent was arguing on the side of her client by agreeing that nothing is something. At this point, the judge wearily recessed court, declaring that he intended to damp his brainwaves with tonic cord therapy. As soon as court reconvened, the judge asked if either party objected to the swearing in of a panel of semanticists. There was no objection, and so, before deciding on the dismissal motion, the judge submitted the problem to the panel. With a squad of burly bailiffs keeping order among the venerable semanticists, the question finally came to a vote. The majority decided that a vacuum is something. The judge denied the defendant's motion for dismissal, heard the case, and found for the plaintiff. He awarded to the university 40 million credits, but legal expenses and the adverse publicity bankrupted Vac Inc. It paid nothing. Law of identity. Any judgment of the court is a true judgment in all succeeding cases where the circumstances are the same. Smith v. General Teletote, 3016, 24 UN 612. Jack Smith, a clerk in the Titan branch of the First Solar Bank and Trust Company, filed a civil suit against General Teletote. He sought to recover damages for injuries he had sustained while utilizing the facilities of the passenger division of that firm. Under a governmental Class F priority, his heart could not stand the strain of spaceship travel. He had returned to his native Terra via Teletote. He charged General Teletote with garbling him in transmission. General Teletote admitted that its tridimensional scanner had reassembled Smith improperly. The firm also conceded that its Terran operator had been out on a paño drunk, leaving the receptor controls untended and incorrectly adjusted, permitting electronic snow to piebald Smith. But though it acknowledged its carelessness, General Teletote firmly disclaimed any liability. It produced the customary waiver that Smith had signed prior to transmission, absolving General Teletote of all responsibility for mishap in transit and/or upon reception. Smith replied that as he was now obviously not the same individual who had signed the waiver, its terms were not binding on him. General Teletote answered that if Smith was not the same individual, he could not claim damages in the other's name. Having studied the briefs, the Galactic Tribunal ruled that even by the signing of a waiver, an individual cannot divest himself of his inalienable right to his own identity. Smith had just won his case when the ghost image of Smith came forward, pressing claims for a like award. To prove these claims, the ghost image produced witnesses who testified that Smith, too, had emerged from the receptor shortly after Smith, although records failed to show any other transmissions scheduled for that time and place. Smith struggled for sole possession of his identity. He sided with General Teletote in its attempts to disprove Smith II's physical appearance by saying that the latter was merely a partial albino who saw a good chance to cash in on the accidental resemblance. The battle ended suddenly one day in court when the judge intervened, pointing out that both had equally good evidence that there was no doubt that they were the same man, and asked them to effect a compromise. Otherwise, the judge explained, the case would result in a deadlock. Smith I and Smith II quickly came to a settlement. The two set up a partnership with the credits they collected and established a firm which became the foremost competitor of General Teletote. Doctrine of excusable fraud. Deception, when welcomed by the victimized party, comes within the realm of a caveat emptor. Based on a quashed indictment, 3426 UE. Until he worked his great coup, Conway Limbeck was a minor criminal preying on the gullible-minded and larcenous-hearted. He sold interests in a formula for synthesizing ambidextrose sugar. For years he thrived on this formula, which was more than his victims could claim. At the time he dreamed up his brilliant stroke, he was chief steward aboard a Sirius-bound liner. Thanks to forged credentials, he was making a getaway in the most comfortable style. While the liner was approaching Sirius 13, a passenger gave Limbeck a 50-credit tip. Limbeck examined the note. It gave him ideas. He stole into the chart room and trimmed the blank edges from the astronautical maps. These plastic strips had the official heat mark embedded in them. Then Limbeck burgled enough photo supplies to counterfeit the strips into notes amounting to 3 trillion credits. When the liner landed on Sirius 13, Limbeck hastened to the presidential shack. Convincing credentials vouching for Limbeck as representative plenipotentiary of the IO Trading Trust gained him immediate admittance. After the ceremonial somersaults were exchanged, Limbeck announced that the trust had authorized him to negotiate for that season's output of 2 mule. The president was hard of smelling until the interpreter wafted that Limbeck had finally raised his offer to 2.5 trillion credits. When he gave vent to his great satisfaction, the president nearly bowled Limbeck over. Limbeck chartered a vessel with his remaining 500 billion credits and took off with his precious payload. His vessel had hardly come out of synergy when the Siriutes realized that Limbeck had jetted a fast one on them. A Sirius 13 patrol intercepted and boarded Limbeck's vessel. Limbeck's heart sank as he faced the boarding party. Then, to his amazement, he scented that the Siriutes were emitting friendly laughs. Their leader passed over a new agreement for Limbeck to sign. It was a contract for 2 mule futures. In bewilderment, Limbeck read the terms. They were extremely favorable to him, especially the explicit condition that he was to make payment in counterfeit credits only. The Siriutes told him they valued the counterfeit more than the genuine. This fetish of theirs, they explained, stemmed from the darkest age of their history when a tyrant had set himself up through fraud. The revolutionary fervor with which they at last overthrew him fired in them a passion for skepticism. For this reason, they treasured symbols of disbelief. Limbeck was more than happy to sign the contract, but news of the serious situation outsped his vessel, and the GBI nailed him. However, the galactic government had no evidence with which to pin the counterfeiting charge on Limbeck, as the proud possessors of the fakes had hidden them and would not yield them up. The most that the government could do was to put a brake on his future activities. It enjoined him from counterfeiting. Sirius 13 demanded that Limbeck fulfill the contract. The Galactic Tribunal ruled that the contract was illegal and invalid, but the Secretary for Galactic Defense privately informed Limbeck that he was anxious to see the deal come off, as Tumul was vital to defense. Limbeck, of course, was equal to the problem. He arranged a secret rendezvous in deep space. The Siriutes and Limbeck exchanged Tumul and currency. After Limbeck's departure, the Siriutes noticed an inscription beginning to appear in each of the notes. The inscription read, "Genuine," passed as counterfeit. This double fraud doubly delighted the Siriutes, and they gratefully bestowed upon Limbeck their highest award. The metal, of course, was made of synthetic platinum. Origins of Galactic Etiquette. Prefatory note. Man rippled out through the galaxy, learning. He was learning, often the hard way, to abandon the set notions of morality that had conditioned him. He was learning that the guiding hand of the past could not reach from star to star. He was learning to evaluate new situations arising out of changed conditions. In sum, he was learning that etiquette varies with environment. At first, breaches of etiquette were all too common. The trouble they caused resulted largely from twin errors. The offender erred in failing to use his intelligence to determine the proper social expedient, and the one taking offense erred in failing to allow for the blunderer's ignorance. To reconcile conflicting ways of life without allowing one to impose its beliefs, shames, and fears upon another is the Galactic Council's mission. In 2937, the Galactic Council consolidated its counseling services into the Department of Etiquette. It commissioned experts with a background of comparative studies in ecology, sociology, and psychology. These experts took the generic title of MLE from the initials of Manners, Logic, Expediency, not, as many think, from Emily Post, a probably mythical authority on Terran etiquette. The following examples of galactic etiquette are a cross-section of MLEing in its formative stage. From the microfiles of MLE Zell Pret, 2916 to 3040, Dean of Durban, 11 MLEs. Question. 3 years ago, a friend of mine disappeared. He had been working on a self-popping cereal when it exploded. He left no trace, and so we held mourning rites over the spot we believed he had last occupied. 6 months ago, he reappeared. But naturally, until he goes through the birth ceremony, we must religiously follow the custom of not seeing him. He is taking unfair advantage of his invisibility. Judging by his mischief-making, I suspect that he staged the explosion to cover his leaving, and I shudder to think of what he must have done during those missing years. Now he walks right into our houses, helps himself to our best liquor, snatches food from our grasp, and pinches our wives. And he caps these indignities by tying our eye stalks into neat bows, turning our unseeing eyes upon ourselves. What do you advise? Fit to be tied. Answer. You have a knotty problem, fit to be tied. To see how to cut the knot, simply follow the lesson you learn from the following example. Alusted Anstef, 2613 to 2709, a Prubnild III feather magnate who sculpted for a hobby, taught his son Rusica to believe in his philosophy, which held that the mind never can gather facts enough to be sure that one course of action is wiser than another, that what now seems good may in the long run prove bad. One day in 2679, Alusted stood on a high scaffold in his studio. He was absorbedly putting the finishing touches to a colossal statue. He stepped back to admire his work. He fell. The sudden stop didn't kill him, as he belonged to a metallic race. It merely dented him. Shakily, he grasped the scaffolding to pull himself upright. The scaffolding toppled. It struck the top of his head. Again, his iron constitution saved his life, but as he happened to be slanting in the right position relative to the magnetic lines of force of the planet, the blow permanently magnetized him. He lay dazed for a while, then his head cleared and he started to get up. His heart bonged when he found himself stuck to the steel flooring. He strained but couldn't pry himself loose. He needed help and called out. He grimaced at the undignified sight he presented, but welcomed the ring of his son Rusica's footsteps. Somewhat bad-temperedly, he explained what had happened. Rusica stood watching his father thoughtfully. Then he slowly reflected aloud. "Analyzing the situation," he said, "I must weigh my desires and good intentions against unforeseeable effects." By now, adding to Alusted's embarrassment, a group of his friends had gathered. They listened, some impatiently, some amusedly, to Rusica's careful reasoning. At last, Rusica made up his mind. Taking the long view, he found himself unable to judge whether he would harm or help his father and or society by acting, and so, certain that good would come of freeing his father from the floor, he went out. Less philosophical, three of Alusted's friends came closer to take hold of the fallen magnate. Three clangs echoed through the room, and the three friends were sticking to Alusted. The remaining friends wisely used ropes to tug loose and sort out the quartet. Alusted gratefully wanted to shake hands with his rescuers, but they moved out of reach, wary of his personal magnetism. They suggested that he undergo heat and so lose his drawing power. Among themselves, they muttered about Rusica's unfilial conduct. But Alusted, proud that his teachings had taken, resoundingly praised Rusica for sticking to them. Now, fit to be tied, you and I know that Alusted was rationalizing a defeat. His case shows how a stern doctrine may boomerang. Your problem will answer itself, I believe, when your not seeing makes you blunder into your friend in ways I leave to your imagination. Of course, I don't counsel that you run him down or through, but after he experiences 2 or 3 close calls, he will decide to arrange for his rebirth. From the Microfiles of MLE Atrata Baratar, 2966 to 3187, Signian expert, author of the famous melanchochorific memoirs. Question. My neighbor hovers about, making disparaging remarks while I'm bleaching or dyeing my feathers. It's nearly molting time, and I'm afraid she'll want to come along when I shop for falsies. Would it be proper for me to tell her to go preen herself? Ruffled. Answer. Patience, Ruffled. If your neighbor's kibitzing becomes overly annoying, you may with propriety ask her to desist. However, you'll do well to think of this. There are occasions when it's perfectly correct for one to kibitz. For example, when a Grombian philosopher seems lost in abstract thought, other Grombians deliberately make all manner of distracting sounds and gestures. They do this to remind him of the omnipresence of environment. Largely speaking, of course, most galactic societies frown on derogatory kibitzing because of the totalitarian taint clinging to even such a modified form of spying. But in all societies, constructive kibitzing has become acceptable ever since 2516. In that year, a scout ship of the University of Capella expedition crashed in the wilderness of Deneb 9. A twisted beam pinned the scout in the wreckage. Only the thrust of his arms held the beam from crushing his chest. But his arms soon tired, and the weight of the beam slowly but inexorably settled. The magnetic storm that had caused the crash made it impossible for the command ship to get a fix on the lost scout. So when the scout failed to return or report, search parties set out on the ground to cover the area from opposite ends. As they made their way toward each other, both parties became self-consciously aware of an arboreal creature that flitted back and forth between them. First, it would hover over Search Party A, and with bright, beady eyes watch the members blasting their way through the brush. Then it would swing back to give its attention to Search Party B. These bursts of scrutiny were distracting to the Capellans. They were itching to scare off the creature, but respect for all forms of life channeled their energy into the search for the rapidly weakening scout. After several hours of shuttling, the arboreal being diffidently addressed the members of Search Party B. An alien voice appeared to creep into their thoughts. It said, "Pardon me for intruding upon your minds, but would it be sporting if I were to tell you whether or not you are warm?" So, ruffled, you see how one being may be in a position to do others a better turn than anyone imagines. You see how the others may be in a position to deprive themselves of that aid. Fortunately, in this case, everything worked out happily. At length, but happily. But you see how easy it is for beings to fail to read each other's purposes? So try to keep from letting your annoyance with your neighbor's fault-finding open a breach between you. Remember what birds of a feather must do. From the microfiles of MLE Naia Mu, 3054 to 3197, who won fame in the Semini sector. Question. I recently had a pleasant visit at the Vernay branch of the Galactic Museum. I saw, and rather fell in love with, an outer garment made of animal pelts. I'd like to synthesize a duplicate of it. Would such a garment be socially acceptable today? Madcap. Answer. Stick to non-objective covering, Madcap. Otherwise, you violate a long-standing taboo. This usage traces back to the disappearance of Catherine Roman, Miss Terra of 2403. Among the prizes she won when she gained the title was a mutated coat with 4 kilo credits. She wore it while enjoying another prize, a trip around the galaxy. She never completed the trip, however, for she disappeared while on a stopover in Tassanak. The natives of Tassanak are a fur-bearing race. They turned out in honor of Catherine's much-publicized visit in a crowd that spread over the spaceport like a rug. Unfortunately, Catherine's appearance rubbed the nap the wrong way. She stepped out of the spaceship and waved and smiled at the Tassanakians, and while their standards of beauty found Catherine wanting, they were anxious to make her feel welcome, and so they had rehearsed spontaneous cheering for days. But when they saw that her coat consisted of pelts very like their own, their cheers changed to catcalls. Catherine's chaperone sensed the reason for the resentment and urged her to keep the fur coat out of sight during the stopover. Catherine reluctantly agreed. When they reached the hostelry, Catherine started to put the coat away, lingering over the packing process. She couldn't resist giving the soft, rich fur one last stroke, and that undid the effect of her chaperone's urging. Deaf to all warnings and pleas, Catherine wrapped herself in her fur coat and went out into the streets to do a bit of sightseeing. She didn't return, and no Terran eye ever again saw Miss Terra of 2403 alive. The natives of Tassanak held contests too. Tassenac's best-dressed female of 2404 won the title by sporting a supple jacket of something remarkably like humanoid skin. That's why I urge you to drop your idea of synthesizing a fur coat, Madcap. Only when you've inherited one is it in good taste for you to wear a fur coat. From the microfiles of MLE Sulawea, 3201 to 3370, Swind 4, expert, who also created a stir as a musician. Question. I've just come back from running a trading post on Tontaway 2. I've come back empty-handed. Cecily, my competitor, has come back with all his arms full, and I can't understand why. I remember the shock I felt when I first saw Cecily acting boorishly. There he stood in the middle of a horde of bellowing natives. He was nodding and smiling as if he understood what they were bellowing, and all the while he was rudely holding fingers in his ears, shutting out the deafening blast that passes for talk. I laughed to myself because I was sure he was taking the wrong tack. It came as a blow when he began reaping a windfall. The natives were storming him with trade goods and leaving my trading post strictly alone. For a long time I held to my course of politeness. I couldn't bring myself to veer about and follow Cecily's example, and I saw my threshold remaining uncrossed and my goods becoming shop-worn. Finally, I made up my mind. If rudeness was etiquette on Tontaway 2, I would outbore Cecily. And so, though it scandalized me, I forced myself to make awkward attempts at being rude. I thumbed my tongue and stuck out my nose at the natives. I elbowed and shouldered them aside. I tried to drown them out with a vast bellowing of my own until my lungs began to leak. But all in vain. My trade goods stayed becalmed on the shelf. What's the matter? Isn't etiquette what it's puffed up to be? Deflated. Answer. How did you wangle your trading permit? Cecily had the good sense to bone up on the folkways of Tontaway 2. You didn't. You leaped wrongly when you concluded that Cecily was being rude. You remind me of Lena Hahn, 2844 to 2880, of Lorsa 1. While visiting Prague, he heard cries of pain that shook him. The cries led him to a hut, where a Prahi was beating his frail mate brutally. Hahn rushed in to stop the wife-beater. When he recovered from the wife's flesh-clawing and hair-pulling attack on him, Hahn found out that the frail wife had wanted the beating because she was frail. Her broken bones would knit beautifully, and the callus that formed would strengthen them. This is how the females of Prague became fit for the heavy work they do. You, too, rushed in. You should have learned that the natives of Tontaway 2 speak a polyphonic form of double talk. The bellowing you heard was really a combining of two voices, a bass and a treble. The native uses his bass voice to give his running commentary on long-term space-time factors, climate, social forces, and the like. He uses his treble voice to deal with matters of immediate concern, such as trading. The bass is, in the ears of a non-Tontower, so loud that it overpowers the treble. When Cecily stuck his fingers in his ears, he was making practical use of a simple principle to hear speech above a loud continuous noise. Plug your ears. Buy earplugs, Deflated, and try Tontaway 2 again. From the microfiles of MLE Inili Sostora, 3274 to 3386. Seden 10, expert, who redeemed himself many times over after failing in this case. Question. My problem becomes more pressing as my spaceship nears your planet. Some 5 months ago, I hastily snapped shut a yawn. I was in the middle of a spaceship that was in the middle of nowhere, and I was hearing meaningful tapping. I tracked the sound to a porthole. I looked out. I saw nothing but space. The tapping continued. I stepped up the magnification of the porthole and saw the tappers. They were spores. The tapping told me that inside each thick, tough shell was a nucleated mass of thinking protoplasm with a food reserve of starch. For some time I had been yawning out of boredom, and so I eagerly welcomed company, even if that company was protoplasm that communicated by galactic Morse. Phrasing their query most politely, they asked me to let them land on my ship. I tapped back a warm welcome. But as the months dragged along, I lost interest in what the spores had on tap to talk about. We really have nothing in common. What's more, they were, and still are, generating their own atmosphere and are budding and fissioning wildly all over the whole. I'm concerned. This cluster of space barnacles threatens to impair the efficiency of an aerodynamic landing. How can I get rid of them now without negating my original welcoming of them? Host. Answer. Frankly, host, I know nothing about the ways of the spores of space, but I hazard the following. When you point out that they are likely to become incandescent along with your spaceship, you will quickly lose your guests. Postscript. How unfortunate. Host followed my advice, which I based on insufficient data. Actually, his spaceship had passed through a stream of cosmic dust, resulting in millions of infinitesimal punctures. He was unaware that the self-sealing walls failed him. Oxygen seeped out. His yawning was due more to oxygen loss than to boredom. Unfortunately, the spores were polite, much too much so to put him in their debt by telling him that they had sensed his danger and had come to plug the holes with themselves. They left for this reason, rather than because they were looking to their own safety. They converted some of their food reserve of starch into explosive and blasted off into deep space. Soon, Host began to yawn again. From the microfiles of MLE Inks Sorgu, 3021 to 3137. Distinguished Vegan Expert. Question. I recently lost a valuable oligog. A Cetian found it and graciously returned it. When I gushed my gratitude, the Cetian stomped on my tail and stormed out. What do you think of such barbarity? Sore. Answer. Simmer down, Sore. You were at fault. Following this rule should help you in the future. It's better form to express one's thanks to one's benefactor in writing than to do so in person. There are various reasons for this. Many races become embarrassed at a show of gratitude. They have merely done their duty. Others are also merely doing their duty, but resent the trouble another's carelessness puts them to. Still others would place a Freudian interpretation upon your losing an object you consciously value. They would consider your effusive thanks evidence of unconscious hypocrisy. Your Cetian falls into the last cited category. On the other hand, gratitude so delights a Siriut that he will filch an object over and over again in order to enjoy the pleasure of returning it. But perhaps the gravest reason for heeding this rule dates back to de la Mirgue, 2519 to 2667. To his fellow Acarnari, de la Mirgue was a particularly handsome specimen. To humanoids, however, his appearance was horrifying. Solarians especially found the sight of Mirgue so chilling that they froze in terror. The effect on Mirgue was just as great, but in his case the effect was one of intense hurt, for he was extremely sensitive to the reaction of others to himself. His only release for the emotional pressure on his wounded ego was to lash out with an eely tentacle. This tentacle was of modified muscular tissue. On excitation through the nervous system, it discharged a powerful electric shock. In 2602, Mirgue in this manner electrocuted a terrified Terran he encountered while the spaceship he astrogated lay docked on Callisto. To escape his angry pursuers, he stowed aboard a Procyon-bound freighter just before it blasted off. Mirg managed to stay hidden during the early part of the trip, but when he saw Mallory Quayle, mate and sole Terran in the ship's complement, in danger, Mirg impulsively gave away his presence and risked his life to save Quayle's. From his hiding place, Mirg watched Quayle brush against a bare, live wire. Instantly, Mirg slithered to the rescue. He shorted the circuit with his own body. There was a blinding flash. Mirg blew out a fuse gland, but his regenerative powers would soon put him on the mend. Quayle suffered nothing worse than facial burns. Brimming with gratitude, Quayle fumed until he could remove his blindfolding bandages and thank his rescuer face to face. When the moment came, Quayle hurried to the astrogation room where Mirg was now working his passage. As he laid eyes on Mirg, Quayle choked on the words of thanks he had prepared. Terror transfixed him. Hurt, Mirg lashed out with his tentacle. Like you, Sor, Quayle neglected to sound his benefactor's depths, neglected to ask about him. If Quayle had known in advance about Mirg's peculiarities and the effect they would have on himself, he would have been prepared. Then he might have averted his eyes while delivering his thanks. He might even have steeled himself to master the ordeal of looking squarely at Mirg. Or, better yet, he might have dropped Mirg a note of thanks, as you should always do in the future. Origins of Galactic Medicine. Dementia recapitulatica. Atrophy of the cortex and of bilateral areas in the temporal and frontal lobes, characterized by overlapping of past and present thoughts. Etiology. The rejuvenating drug that the Egnanutis of Botine 3 used to reverse the processes of growth causes dementia recapitulatica. Lauro Fisapilt, 2906 to 2949, discovered the drug and was the first Egnanuti to use it. His fear of aging impelled him to find a way of nullifying the process, and when at last he perfected the drug, he drank it eagerly. Unfortunately, he downed an overdose and regressed to an embryo before his assistant could help him. Following users have shown more caution. At some point in their middle years, they take the drug, regress to infancy, then once more proceed through childhood and adolescence. As the Egnanutis reapproach maturity, however, there is the onset of cortical and lobar atrophy, and the symptoms of dementia recap manifest themselves. Symptoms and signs. Past and present thoughts overlap, and the patient is unable to utilize recalled material in forming new concepts. One sufferer may become depressed, irritable, and suspicious, his previous personality acting as a shadowy hangover. Another may become euphoric, happily exchanging childhood reminiscences with himself. Diagnosis and prognosis. Like the Egnanutis, the Glenopis of Clinembly 6 are humanoid and suffer cortical and lobar atrophy. But they should present no diagnostic problem, for the etiology and symptomatology of their condition differ from those of dementia recap. In the case of the Glenopis, obstetricians deliver viable fetuses at varying periods before full term. This is because of the special qualities inhering in each stage as the fetus recapitulates the evolution of the race. The 3-month fetus has vibrissyl feelers and strong pincers that equip it for tunneling. The 4-month fetus has ballast ports and snorkel tubes that fit it for diving. The 5-month fetus has a thick lanugo, an atavistic hairy coat that enables it to withstand freezing temperatures. The 6-month fetus has adhesive digits that let it walk on the walls and ceiling of a room. This ability is invaluable in a spaceship during free flight, and many 6-month Glenopi fetuses grow to be crewmen. The 7-month fetus becomes the humanoid type. Because the Glenapists have been practicing this form of birth control universally, no one has any idea what the full-term Glenapi would be like. The Glenapi fetus readily adapts to its atrophied state and shows no symptoms beyond those common to immaturity. The dementia recap sufferer, with proper treatment, may hope to live a relatively normal existence. Treatment. Occupational therapy best serves both society and the patient. The dementia recap sufferer finds his groove in teaching history, writing poetry, or ghostwriting political speeches. Trudner syndrome. Thallophytic infection of the skin characterized by concurrent rashes, blisters, lesions, devil's pinches, purpura simplex, crusting, scaling, and oozing. Etiology. Responding to the needs of their acropani host, parasitic algae produce antigenic substances. These antigens cause various types of eruptions to appear on the sensitized skin of the host. Symptoms and signs. The eruptions appear suddenly, coinciding with meeting a stranger. Diagnosis and prognosis. The multiple symptoms, together with their instantaneous development, make the Trudner syndrome easily distinguishable from other skin infections. The prognosis is excellent when there is understanding on the part of the observer. Treatment. The physician must not allow the symptoms to paralyze him. Viewing the patient with philosophic detachment, he must use cool kindness and frank friendliness to reassure the patient. This was the example Dr. Ernest L. Trudner, 3021 to 3150, set when he met an acropani. It happened in 3102 on the first solar expedition to Murzim 6. Dr. Trudner was in the landing party when they encountered an acropani at the outskirts of a town. Upon seeing the strangers, the humanoid acropani's short, fine hair, encrusted with purple algae, became almost invisible beneath a horrifying assortment of sores that blossomed before their eyes. Only strong indoctrination in contact methodology prevented the men from fleeing in fear or blasting the acropani down. Dr. Trudner ordered the crewmen carrying the force projector to throw up a protective screen, but it was too late. All of the men began itching unbearably. Several threw up. Dr. Trudner ignored his own discomfort to examine the others. Finding nothing somatically wrong with any of the party, he decided that the itching and vomiting were subjective responses to the symptomatic appearance of the acropani. He quickly administered a hypnotic booster of contact methodology. The itching and vomiting stopped. Dr. Trudner ordered the party to return to the spaceship. He himself moved to a safe distance from the acropani and lowered the protective screen. Using remote controls, he ran out the servo-mechanical diagnoser. The acropani didn't budge, but submitted to a thorough job of diagnosis. Dr. Trudner could recognize, from where he stood, the symptoms of measles, chickenpox, smallpox, mumps, scarlet fever, cellulitis, lymphadenitis, typhoid fever, cutaneous anthrax, bubonic plague, tularemia, Tsutsugamushi disease, cutaneous leishmaniasis, leprosy, yaws, coccidiodomycosis, chromoblastomycosis, rhinosporidiosis. But through the diagnoser, he ruled out all those diseases. He found there was no basis for suspecting bacteria or viruses or fungi. He discovered the presence of the algae and realized that the disorder was totally innocuous, that the syndrome was a protective device. The acropani was attempting to keep strangers from the town by displaying symptoms of most of the infectious diseases Dr. Trudner had heard of. It was a scatter technique. One of the symptoms must suggest a disease that a stranger feared. It was analogous to the way the quadruple-jointed cresar of Rigel 9 simulates liquescence and flows away from its nesting place to divert intruders from its young, and to the way the mineral metabolizers of Denebula 6 become radioactive to render themselves unappetizing to creatures of prey. Dr. Terudner convinced the Acropani that the Solarians wished to be friends. The symptoms vanished when Dr. Terudner doled out a placebo to the Acropani and treated him to a creaky display of witch doctor dancing as a face-saving expedient for the patient's ego. Periodic deluminescence, a condition characterized by intermittent inability to light up. Etiology. Periodic deluminescence is a form of conversion hysteria. The cause is a psychic disturbance. By its very nature, the condition is peculiar to the Ahimnotoi race of humanoids on Fomalhaut 3. The skin of an Ahimnotoi has 6 different kinds of pigment cells. There are strawberry, raspberry, cherry, orange, lemon, and lime colors. The pigment cells have muscular walls that contract and expand. This shrinking and swelling enables the skin to take on a large variety of hues, tints, and shades, which are the Ahimnotoi's means of communicating. The pigments are bioluminescent, so darkness does not bar conversation. The phenomenon of periodic deluminescence began in antiquity. A possible legendary wandering revivalist, an Ahimnotoi by the name of Sesamhi, had appeared in the city of Elmos. It was the time of the festival of the East Wind, and pilgrims thronged the streets. Sesamhi chose a busy crossroad and began to preach. The officer on the beach saw that the revivalist was blocking traffic and flashed a loud plaid order to move on. But Sesamhi stood still, smiling sadly at the officer. The officer clashed his colors in rage. He broke through the crowd and grabbed Sesamhi. Sesamhi answered the officer's wrath softly, in pastels. Disregarding Sesamhi's remarks, the officer dragged him before the magistrates of Elmos. The magistrates asked Sesamhi his name. His pigment cells remained inert. They asked again. He gave no response beyond the pale smile. The inquisitors thought there was something fishy, apologies to ichthyoids, about his failure to respond, seeing his recalcitrant behavior as a threat to the whole structure of government, so they resorted to more forcible means of cross-questioning. While they tortured him, they mocked him, dyeing parts of his body in foul groupings of assorted colors. Sesamhi's heart gave out. At this crucial moment he flashed weakly what he had tried to tell the arresting officer, that he was colorblind. Long fasting had caused a vitamin deficiency that atrophied his fovea. But because they had not known, he forgave them. Then he died. Sheepishly, they dumped his pastel body in an abandoned quarry. But that was not the last of Sesamhi. Ahimnotoi whispered to Ahimnotoi in subdued colors, and what they whispered was that Sesamhi had not really died, that a faithful follower had seen life in the body and had spirited him from Fomalhaut 3 to another world. As the story grew, it gathered momentum and became an irresistible force. Rainbow shouted. The following year, at the time of the Festival of the East Wind, the first cases of periodic deluminescence appeared. Since then, yearly attacks of periodic deluminescence have become an almost universal phenomenon on Fomalhaut 3. Psychoanalysts theorize that it arises from unconscious conflict, which comes about when the Festival of the East Wind sharply reminds the Ahimnotoi of Sesamhi. The Ahimnotoi projects himself into Sesamhi's place and suffers the same frustration. And periodic deluminescence defends the ego from recognizing the infantile wishes, hostilities, and guilt feelings that are reawakened. Symptoms and signs. Rising body temperature. Inability to luminesce when conversing in darkness. Diagnosis and prognosis. Periodic deluminescence is easy to differentiate from organic disorders, malingering, and schizophrenia. Body temperature soars, though not high enough to affect the enzyme which catalyzes bioluminescence. Bioluminescence would therefore still be under nervous control. This indicates that the breakdown is due to hysteria. The onset of the symptoms at the time of the Festival of the East Wind is highly significant. The attack lasts 3 days, clearing up afterward of its own accord. Treatment. The patient should rest his pigment cells and meditate rather than try to talk in darkness. Larytonia fever, an acute disease of the central nervous system characterized by involuntary clapping. Etiology. Direct contact is the source of infection. Healthy carriers are often the cause of outbreaks. The Larytonia virus enters the body through a break in the skin, invades the bloodstream by way of the lymphatic channels, and attacks the brain cord and peripheral nerves by causing thiamine deficiency. Symptoms and signs. As degeneration progresses, the patient increasingly demonstrates irrational thought, marked impairment of perception, and loss of muscular control. The last evidences itself in seeing double. The patient reaches out confusedly, seeking to press and to register the external objects which he sees as double images. To observers, this appears to be a clapping gesture. Diagnosis and prognosis. The peculiar clapping gesture differentiates Larytonia fever from all other diseases of the central nervous system. The condition is slowly progressive but is compatible with long life. Incapacitation is gradual and increasing. Prevention. Identification and isolation of carriers are essential. Treatment. Thiamine, 20 to 50 milligrams or more, according to metabolic rate and physiological type, intramuscularly or intravenously daily. Leet, 3,000 cc daily. Caution. On Cotenda 12, special care is necessary when administering Leet. Cotendins are marsupialoids with a pouch high on the back. This pouch holds a plant and a solution of nutrient salts. The plant grows with its roots dipped in the solution. In return for the nutrient salts, the plant disposes of excess carbon dioxide and provides leafy shade. Leet upsets the symbiotic balance by draining the solution. This withers the plant and asphyxiates the cotendin. Most cotendins have a tremendous craving for Leet. However, too often in their history this craving has mastered their judgment. After a Leet orgy in 2610 threatened to wipe out the race, the surviving cotendins banned the use of Leet except for medicinal purposes. In 3090, a new outbreak of Larytonia fever began to sweep around the planet. Dr. Grivon Tissotti, 3151 to 3126, a Terran exchange doctor, soon pinpointed the source of infection. It was a Larytonia-carrying individual peddling his infectious touch. Leet-craving cotendins willing to pay the price in credits and health were buying the disease to get the cure. Dr. Tissotti rushed to alert the civil authorities. They greeted him with applause. He told them of his discovery and gave them his advice. They applauded and asked him to repeat his words. He repeated them over and over, each time to wilder applause. Then they asked him to submit his findings in writing, in cotendin hieroglyphs. Dr. Tissotti realized the cost of delay. He also realized that the official bodies were suffering from Larytonia fever and that he could expect no cooperation. Without wasting further time and breath, he returned to his lab. There he prepared a large amount of a soporific. He loaded it on his copter and flew to the government warehouse containing all the Leet on Cotenda. He overpowered the guards, cotendins are 2 feet high, entered the building, and adulterated the Leet with soporific. When word spread that patients were sleeping through their doses of the heat instead of enjoying the effect, the outbreak of Lartonia fever ended quickly. And just as quickly, Dr. Tassotti found himself on a Terra-bound spaceship, the irritated authorities of Katenda having invoked the law which forbade the distribution of sleeping medicine without prescriptions. Incomplete plasticizing. A malfunction of body covering characterized by fluid condition of new-forming skin. Etiology. This disorder affects the natives of Afhiltu 9, a treeless, grassy, muggy, and very small planet. Faithfully, every 3 of their years, the igneous rock underlying the crust of their planet had superheated the groundwater into steam, activating a belt of geysers. The body chemistry of the natives had adapted to the cycle. Every 3 years, their thermoplastic skin was ready to shed. Their body exuded a colloidal liquid which was the basis of their new skin. With perfect timing, the geysers jetted steam. The natives paraded through the steam, and the colloidal coating coagulated, forming a gel. This gave them a spanking new weatherproof, waterproof skin. But in 3030, the cycle broke down. The belt of geysers encircling the globe failed to spout on schedule. The natives tried to keep their old skin from sloughing off, but soon found that patching up was a losing struggle. They begged their gods for help. A crippled Terran spaceship made a landing, its crew hoping to find materials for the repairs the ship needed. The natives rejoiced, believing that the spacemen were heavenly messengers. The natives had prayed to their gods, and now everything would be made right again. The heavenly messengers tried to keep them from looking dismayed. They were willing to help, if they could, in return for the materials they needed, but they lacked facilities for processing 10 billion beings. Yet, if they failed to solve the problem, they would be revealed as false gods, and would find the natives raging against them. Then they might not get what they needed, or live to use it if they got it. Symptoms and signs. The patient exhibits a reticulating outer skin that floats uneasily over the unplasticized inner skin. Diagnosis and prognosis. The reticulating and sliding of outer skin simplify diagnosis. Incomplete plasticizing responds readily to proper treatment. Treatment. Dr. Mike Nagel, 2996 to 3098, was the surgeon of the Terran spaceship. He picked a random sampling of natives for studying. He tested them and found that their body temperature was much higher than the Terrans and that they were allergic to certain Terran substances. Dr. Nagel sweated to find the solution, but he didn't know he had come up with it until a native, in a frenzy of devotion, pressed lips to the doctor's palm. The heavenly messenger looked on bug-eyed at what followed. The native writhed, fainted, and fell to the floor of the sick bay. His outer skin sloughed off. The new skin began to firm up. Dr. Nagel quickly took the native's temperature. It had risen 25 degrees Fahrenheit above normal. The doctor scraped the sweaty palm the native had kissed and analyzed the scrapings. His findings? The sweat had caused the native to run the high fever. The fever heat had caused the colloidal coating to coagulate. Meanwhile, the native came to, got up, saw his new skin, danced out. Dr. Nagel knew he would spread the news and got busy. The crew turned a compartment into a Turkish bath. At the end of 3 months, they had collected enough sweat for global distribution. The grateful natives heaped upon the spacemen the materials they needed many times over. Soon the spaceship was in shape to go. The shock of its takeoff jolted every geyser on the tiny planet into action. The natives stretched their new skins in frantic dance at this parting gift. Infectious keratolysis, a communicable disease characterized by a moth-eaten appearance. Etiology. Salicylic acid-forming bacilli caused infectious keratolysis. The acid attacks the carapace of chelonoids, the cell walls of fungoids, the hair and nails of humanoids. Symptoms and signs. The onset is insidious, the typical moth-eaten appearance becoming evident only in the latter stages of the disease. Diagnosis and prognosis. A moth-eaten appearance may be misleading without the supporting evidence of the salicylic acid and the bacilli. The classical example is the mistaken diagnosis of Dr. O. Redmeld, 3616 to 3666. Dr. Redmeld was a Ganymedean medical missionary to Ganap III. He founded a paradise of untouched splendor. The dominant form of life was a primitive society of beautiful winged creatures who spent their days flourishing their bright colors in the gold-moted air. Dr. Redmeld arrived at a Ganap settlement in 3640. The Ganapi smilingly welcomed him, then continued weaving their kaleidoscopic patterns in the sky. Determining to get the lie of the land, Redmeld boldly struck into the surrounding forest. Before he had gone very far, a loud crashing stopped him. The cause of the noise followed it shortly. The creature was vegetarian, but the doctor didn't know that at the time. He saw the long armored body, the huge jaws, the waving antennae, the 3 pairs of propelling legs, the several pairs of prolegs armed with hooks, and he drew his gun and fired. The creature heaved a bit, then lay still. The shot had split off a section of armor. Dr. Redmeld could see that something had been eating away at the inner surface of the armor. Its moth-eaten appearance immediately suggested infectious keratolysis to him. Without analyzing the fluid that saturated the inner portion of the armor, he felt sure that it was salicylic acid, teeming with bacilli. The thought of disease in this paradise appalled him. Another loud crashing broke through this thought. Another huge creature appeared. Seeing its dead fellow, it threw itself across the body and clicked its enormous jaws in mourning. Redmeld shivered and fired again. This creature's armor showed the menacing moth-eaten appearance too. Burning with zeal, Redmeld pushed through the forest. Single-handedly, he would root out the evil. He gripped his gun tightly, alert for his next encounter. But the next encounter took him by surprise. 3 of the beautiful winged Ganapi came silently down and seized him. They flew him to a clearing where their tribunal sat in judgment. It was at his trial that he learned that the creatures he had killed were not carriers of infectious keratolysis. The moth-eaten appearance was due to molting fluid that had been busily digesting the chitin of the giant larvae, enabling the imago, the winged creature, to break out. The tribunal ruled that Redmeld might remain on Ganap III only if he agreed to limit his work to doctoring the superficial cuts and bruises of infant larvae. This he did. Prognosis is good. The mortality in infectious keratolysis is less than 1%. Treatment. The physician must first draw off the salicylic acid and neutralize affected areas with an alkaline solution. Then he should administer an antibiotic. Ballpointin has been responsible for dramatic improvement. The initial basic dosage is 4 grams daily, with decreasing doses as improvement becomes manifest. Some authorities recommend using lobdomectin as a prophylactic against secondary invaders. The basic dosage is 300,000 units given intravenously daily. Cosmetic or structural considerations may call for the use of plastic spray to fill in and smooth over the ravaged areas. As to color, the plastic spray may be in matching or contrasting hues. Many patients prefer the latter. A striking polka dot scar provides a gambit for wedging one's operation into a conversation. Origins of Galactic Advice to the Lovelorn. In 2534 UE, all advice to the Lovelorn counselors officially came under the departmental designation 509. In Terran legend, 509 is the modern form of DIX, a Latin date supposedly fixing the birth of advice to the Lovelorn in a chaplain's office at a military fort in New Jersey. In 2604, a schizoid being finding himself in a jam learned that the 509 he had sought and received advice from was himself. This sharpened the realization that a questioner generally presents only one side of a problem, the questioner's, and that side in the most flattering light. As a result, a 509, or one of the 509's detectives, called Dix, tries to investigate all sides. 509ing has its dangers. Mer Perbran, 2702 to 2812, of Propus, too, died in the line of duty, an empathetic telepath. He drowned in another being's stream of consciousness. But 509ing has its compensations. Bosediga Mani, 3226 to 3312, of Matar II, spearheaded the successful fight to forestall zeal-inflamed agents of museums. These, thinking to race against time, sought by any means, including kidnapping and quick freezing of individuals, to lay in a hoard of specimens of a race growing rare, and by doing so were speeding the race's doom of phylum forgetum. The following examples show how advice to the Lovelorn gradually altered, how it grew from handling emotional problems on the interpersonal level to those on the supracultural level. From the microfiles of Kon Satya, 2613 to 2718, of Yuga 10, whose affectation of simplicity is of a piece with his being the founder, 2735, of the Primitivists, a group of 509s who believe that a being destroys his feelings by scrutinizing them, his thinkings by analyzing them. Dear 509 Satya, my spouse doesn't love me. Oh, he shows some degree of affection, but if he sincerely loves me, why does he stop short of the very thing that would make me the happiest female on Alphard 1? Instead, I am among the most anguished and bitter. You see, there are just the two of us in these tenebrous galleries, and to make it even worse, I am often alone, because he spends so much time traveling on surveying missions far from his home and his office. I feel so solitary, but he selfishly says he is satisfied with things the way they are and doesn't conceive of adding to our family. This is especially rattling because ever since it became obvious that he was failing to live up to his familial duties, my friends have started to insinuate that he's stingy. And though I strongly deny such insinuations, I privately suspect that he's unwilling to add to anything but his bundle. It embarrasses me so to see even my mother and stepmothers. It is awfully trying to have to meet their sympathizing but scandalized stares. I feel less and less like leaving our dim house, although staying in this echoing solitude is maddening enough to make me want to scream. Meanwhile, my thews mat as I idle in my narrow zone of living. Row upon row of galleries go to waste, and yet the effect is constricting. To my horror, I find myself tempted to say or do something shocking or upsetting, anything to cast off the weight of gloomy days and nights. How I long to hear the slither of little coils. Do you see hope for us? Or do you suppose my spouse has been surreptitiously romancing while on his surveying missions? Nonplussed. Dear Nonplussed, informants tell my Dix no outside romancing. Speaking cold-bloodedly is bad sign. Embarrassing. You, belonging polygamous society, have husband having only one wife, namely you. No need feeling shame consulting me, nonplussed. Am understanding. Not like my wives, one under-understanding, other over-understanding. Elementary problem, easy answer. Is binding on husband when first wife is proposing to other female in husband's behalf. She become another better fraction. Is joke. Is possible pitfall? Is. Like what? Husband showing new wife over fondness. Resultant position of old wife? Is speaking frankly, watch. Eased out. Praise be. Why praise be? Is profitable market. Many husbands hunting old-fashioned wife. Please send phostat of self. 509 Satya. From the microfiles of Tib Sev, 2628 to 2720, a 509 of Pleione 5. His fine job during the notorious love riots that had the galaxy agape won him the rank of senior. Dear Senior 509 Tib, 3 double moons ago I married a priestess of the marsupial totem of Merope 6. Pretty quickly I noticed a clicking sound whenever she pranced. I found that her pouches, the forepouch at least, the afterpouch has remained veiled, contained pellets of some kind, and that day by day the forepouch was emptying. I was very curious, but profane prying into the personal practices of a priestess is prohibited, so I prudently put no questions. But I paid heed, and it repaid me with a closer glimpse. The pellets were parched peas. Pleasing my spouse is my prime aim. Realizing she was partial to peas, I quickly purchased a quantity of best quality peas in the Borso, enough to fill a 12-gallon pot, and to surprise her I quietly deposited some every evening while she pounded the pillow. My peak performance came on the night I poured a palmful of peas without provoking a quiver in response. But although I patiently prevented her supply from petering out, a pall fell upon her. I quadrupled my pains. But as time passed, she acquired a Tower of Pisa posture and a paranoiac look. This worried me, the more so as she had let drop that she was to undergo the added strain of presiding at secret ceremonies. 9 days ago, late on the day of the Delphic oracle, I was foggily pondering the problem of restoring her physical and psychic balance when a posse of priestesses paraded into our home. Their measured pace was like the pounding pulse of doom. As one, they stopped, and ignoring me, gave my wife a pregnant look. It was more than she could bear. With a piercing cry, she lost her self-possession and passed into a coma. The posse departed as it had come. On waking, my wife withdrew into a shell. She sits staring at the opposite wall. Please tell me how to help her regain her poise. Ura. Dear Ura, I'm not privy to the marsupial mysteries, but I think I can unperplex you. The way I figure it, you're the precipitating factor. Your wife wasn't eating the peas. She was transposing 1 pea per day from her forepouch to her afterpouch. They weren't her particular passion. They were for computing the passage of time. Your interfering made her lose count, stuffed her afterpouch full to bursting, gave her a list and a persecution complex. Both of you should have minded your proverbial P's and Q's. Your wife should have perceived peril more promptly. The excess P avoirdupois should have given her the cue. Instead of apparently going haywire and thrusting peas into her afterpouch, regardless of the count, she should have immediately subtracted the number of peas there from the number of days from festival to festival. In that way, she wouldn't have let the day of the Didelphic oracle find her missing from her post. Her sister priestesses plainly consider this a grave infraction. There's no telling how they'd react if you were quixotic enough to confess the part you played. I suggest you take your wife to a more peaceful place. Senior 509 Tib. From the microfiles of Rod Pillar, 2925 to 3014 of Atik 1, he won renown for answering a tortuous question with, "Huh?" Dear 509 Pillar, due to the type of sexual dimorphism peculiar to Algol 2, my wife has a much greater amplitude and rate of tremor than I. To me, she seems a blur, a shimmer on the verge of coming into being, green as copper and gray-pink as manganese, the way all the females of Algol 2 look to all the males. But I had seen stop-motion phostats of her, and I fell in love with her and wooed and won her. The other day we had a family reunion, and you can imagine the shock I suffered when I found that the weary-looking female clinging to my strigil in the photo of that occasion is not the girl I fell in love with. It now turns out there was a switch, and it was my genuine love's homely sister I married and have been living with for 7 years. Worse yet, since our return from the reunion, another fear has been plaguing me. What if there has been another switch, and the female stridulating so cheerfully about my house is not the homely sister, but her even homelier one? My fear is not entirely groundless. A ewer of milk still churns to butter in my wife's grasp, but the consistency somehow seems different. How may I know peace once more? Heart-heavy. Dear Heart-heavy, you fell in love not with the girl you took to be your wife, but with her phostat. You're in love with love's shadow. For 7 years you lived happily in the illusion that your wife was the female in the phostats. In reacting to the revelation that she wasn't, you pass over several elements lightly. Doesn't it seem strange that in 7 years of wedded bliss, an induced sympathetic vibration has never, even momentarily, put you in phase with your wife? You've resisted. Admit it now. You didn't really want to see her. You've been content with a blur, for even the genuine love couldn't have come up to your unaging image of her. You could end your doubts by snapping a phostat of your wife or by shining a stroboscopic light on her in the dark, flashing it in time with her vibration to see her as clearly as if she were frozen. But you prefer to preserve the image in your mind. So consider this possibility. Your wife may be neither what you term the homely sister nor what you term the homelier sister. She may be what you think of as the lovely sister. You'll come to believe this. The pendulum will swing from pessimism to optimism. When you reach the far end of the arc, have your local doctor dose you with titanium for mordant and chlorine for substitution reaction. These chemicals will lock you in the blissful state you desire until the next family reunion. 509 Pillar. From the microfiles of Echa Pos, 2913 to 3113 of Corniferous 5. He arranged the 509 anthem synesthetically, for which the Galactic Council awarded him the Anthelian Medal with Meteor Cluster, struck off in type metal. Dear 509 Pos, how hard it is for me to find the right words, for out of a full heart I must tell you of my woe. Only yesterday I was an innocent, cheerful female of Corniferous 6. Today, but to begin at the beginning, I was standing out in the open, forgetting my mother's preachings. Suddenly, out of the corner of my eye, I saw a great moving shadow. Before I could even think of trying to escape or to call out for help, a high-wheeling figure swooped down upon me. My heartbeat drowned in the winnowing of his wings, and I fainted. When I came to, I was in the antechamber of the nest of a young male whom I have known ever since my pre-nubile days. I had held him in high awe, but this thing about facing of his tore away the veil, and I can see him for what he is, the antithesis of honor. He laughs as I cry. He and his myrmidons are keeping me captive against my will, and seem to enjoy watching me throw dust in my eyes. I wring my antenna in vain. The vulgar creature is adamant, even though he does try to soothe me occasionally with butter words, and the promise of brand new lithium beryllium furnishings for this nest. But such antics just make me bridle and antagonize me the more. Enough, I say sternly, italicizing the word, and my thoughts go back to that moment when I stood in the clearing. How my chest expanded with hope that I might always maintain my purity. In that hang-yawn second when I first saw the shadow, little did I anticipate the terrible anticlimax. Mournful. Dear Mournful, Atta girl, 509 Pos. Note, in his column, 509 Pos added the following postscript for the benefit of non-cornephoros. In this girl's society, a bride must emote, making public her antipathy to marriage, no matter how glad she is privately. As a victim of violence, she need not be ashamed that in her essentially ascetic society she is embarked upon a passionate relationship. Her honor is still semantically intact. Her lamentations will soon be at an end. The smile will emerge and displace the sob, for marriage, first and last, is the goal. From the microfiles of Hansa Munkar, 2633 to 2722, of Neckar 5. Atom tracing was his hobby, and he managed, in the course of repeated trips to Terra, to carve a lasting name for himself by reassembling Caesar's own dust. Dear 509 Munkar, oh, hear me, I beg of you. I am of the Marababa Sahim tribe, on the outlying planet Tau Pegasi 115. Recently I moved to the ornate state capital and married a girl of the Aab-Abaa Babab tribe, love triumphing over distaste for these fashionable, dissolute members of the ruling circle. Oh, I never would have become incensed about, much less questioned, my wife's faithfulness, hadn't I a good friend who, in all innocence, idly asked me at a party for the name of the seductive perfume my wife was wearing. With an effort of will, I disguised the dismay that threatened to distend my veins. I told him calmly that I had forgotten the name, but would let him know it as soon as I recalled. At home, at the first opportunity, I searched. At last I discovered an ounce of Carville Eau de Fen 9, hidden behind flush-seamed paneling. To hear was shock enough, but oh, when I saw that my wife was indeed wearing perfume, not hell or the dismal hereafters of the sextillion planets could equal the pardonable jealousy that began to quench in my vitals. She is not using the scent to please me. Oh, no, we of Marababa Sahem have no sense of smell. Ergo, she is using the perfume to lure into baneful dalliance other males, members of her own tribe who are able to smell. Oh, I discount my good friend, although he is one of them. I owe him so much for unwittingly enlightening me. Even in my distress, I must admire the way the fair betrayer hides demon amid devotion. But the many little things that she sachets around doing for me mean simply so many disquieting duplicities, and ring hollowly now that her disloyalty is disclosed. Oh, even the venison ragout that she learned to dish Marababa Sahem style to please me is a burden to down without disgorging. It has me gargling and grunting and panting under the grueling grind of displaying a dissembling smile, as if singing a hymn to her handiwork. Dissolving this dishonored marriage is out of the question. By the fundamental law of my tribe, I must wreak vengeance upon her. With this end in view, I am husbanding my strength. When I feel my hate dislodge my love, I will slay her, lest she cheat and recheat and bring disgrace upon us. Oh, it seems odd that I should be discussing the snatching of life from the one I believed the quintessence of discretion, so odd that I would be laughing if such laughter did not hurt. But I must prove I am no mere cipher in a divided duty to benighted love, but a thing of elemental passions, true to the traditions of my tribe. O distinguished 509, please lend me your moral support. Loch Osis. Dear Loch, very melodramatic, but don't be so ready to listen to your so-called friend. He was being vindictive when he asked you what perfume your wife wears. Dick's informed, I can tell you, he's a scorned ex-suitor of your wife's. Plainly, he's venting his spite. Your wife wears perfume, that's so, but you infer wrongly. True, she's not wearing it to please you, except indirectly. Being unable to smell, you haven't realized that your uncomplaining wife uses perfume to mask the what is to her nose distasteful smell of the what is to your eye cordial showers of magnesium and chlorine that spice your food. Even if that weren't the case, it would still be only natural for a wife to want to smell her best, even if her husband couldn't appreciate it. At any rate, you'll have to sublimate your Venus rage. My dicks have warned your friend to leave the planet. He's probably a good distance past Alhena by now. 509 Munkar. From the microfiles of Kozum Ondas, 2627 to 2810, of Dabi 5. One rare exception to the no-stock answer rule of advice to the lovelorn was the attempt by 509 Ondas to alter the pattern of culture of the dying society of Dabi 10, whose resistance to reason she sought by repetition to wear away. Here are the typical question and the form letter in answer. Dear 509 Ondas, I desire to possess a beautiful girl who lives in dash. Can you recommend a reliable mercenary who will undertake to abduct her for me and bring her to my home in dash? Dash dash. Dear dash dash, you speak not of loving but of coveting. You won't offer the girl your love and ask for her alula in marriage because she might turn you down, and your pride won't let you risk refusal. You won't attempt to run off with her yourself because you might slip up, and to fail would puncture your pride. Although your authorities, believing that fair facts and foul are equally valid when it comes to love, condone the hiring of mercenaries, I must counsel you to heed the sad case of Vry Nin, the lovesick and pride-sick Nin, smarting under the rebuff of his suit, hired mercenaries from Gamma Vulpeculae. He tried to make the briefing short because he found their presence repulsive. He promised Oka, their captain, a lordly gift if the legion the latter headed followed orders to the letter. The mercenaries listened impassively as Nin marked out the acts they were to perform. The simple eyes dotting their torsos stared stonily, even though the vehemence of Nin's spite, when he ordered the slaying of the girl's family, sprayed them with yellow mist. But when he came to describe his love object, the mist turned rose. How could he convey the tantalizing texture of her shapely... He lacked words. So he said, "You'll see there the very most beautiful creature in creation. That's my loved one." Dismissed, They padded away. It seemed to Nin he waited for a mega era. At last, they padded back. Nin looked for the girl eagerly, but vainly. Had her family outbid him and turned the fire of the mercenaries back upon Nin? He grabbed for his weapon, but Oka was quicker. He explained to the dying Nin that the girl's family had apparently feared a raid and must have spirited the girl away. Wary of booby traps, the mercenaries had searched the house. They had found only a warped and warty crone. Following Nin's orders, they had blasted her. A doddering look destroyed Nin's mane. Warped and warty were the words he had lacked. "That was my love," he moaned. "So, my dear ... I hope you will learn from the wrong way the right way to win your love." 509 Undas. From the microfiles of Dod Ona, 2971 to 3152, of Naus III. After long years of service, he met his death when a galloping herd of suozons mistook the creaking of his sinews, the key thongs, to be exact, for their mating call. Dear 509 Ona, the log of the Griff, my spacecraft, shows I am asking you the same question for the third time. Why don't you answer? I'll restate the facts. I made a forced landing in a clearing on Alpha Posidus I. I leafed through the Universal Periplus in my chart room, but it's sadly out of date and tells me nothing about this system. I determined for myself that conditions on this planet were favorable, debarked, made repairs. There was nothing to hold me. The planet seemed only virgin forest. I was about to re-embark when a figure suddened in and out of sight. A girl, no more than a glimpse of olive complexion and willowy form, but it was enough to quicken my pulse. I followed her into the forest. Gone. I would have called, but my fear of further frightening her caused the opening between my vocal cords to stick. All that afternoon I looked. With the coming of dusk, I felt a chill and thought to fell a tree for fuel, but immediately a cheerful warmth enveloped me, and I made my way craftward in a glow. Early next morning, I seemed to hear a voice calling faintly. I was soon at the edge of the clearing. Something drew my gaze to a tree hollow. My hand came out with a crude valentine. It bore my name. I reasoned that colonists of my kind had settled here secretly, that the girl had seen me and was shyly making known her love. She'd slipped into the Griff while I was hunting her through the wood, learned my name from my log. Elated, I waited the next manifestation. It was a makeshift mailbox hung on a tree. Lettered on it was Jeannie. I've always liked that name. Something white fluttered ghost-like down from a tree across the clearing. No one around. I dived for it. A blank sheet of paper. Getting the idea, I wrote a love letter on it and dropped it in the slot. I went back to the Griff to spruce up. When I returned to the mailbox, the letter was gone. Since then, a stream of messages. For some reason, Jeannie keeps shifting the mailbox from tree to tree. Sometimes I think we've trysted in isolated places, because I dimly remember embracing Jeannie. Sometimes Jeannie seems less than a dream, a fragment of a figment, a delusion. At these times, I've tried to reach you. Have I been traveling alone too long? I can't account for my fleeting moods. A while ago I started to carve an arrow-pierced heart in a tree, but something stayed my knife hand. Another time I began to worry that my food was running low. Magically, I found a plant bearing something like a cross between breadfruit and hackberry, just when I'd decided to give up the elusive Jeannie and leave. Where are Jeannie's folks? Where is Jeannie now? I can't stand not knowing. I'm loath to stay, loath to go. Please answer. R.A. Jesse. Dear R.A., I've deliberately delayed answering. Sorry to blight your romance after letting you pine for 71 days, but that's the length of the mating season. Let me explain. You're not loco. You have been involved in a budding romance, but not your own. Jeannie exists, though only in your mind. The alpha Pixidites made her bloom there. They're the trees. They palm off telepathic suggestion on mobile forms of life. For your appointment in lieu of Samara, if you'll pardon a pedantic quip, they adapted to your unconscious desire to meet your dream mate. You may leave now, knowing you've won laurels as a pollinating middleman. You may also legally claim a reasonable service charge. 509 Ona. Origins of the Galactic Short Snorter. It is owing to Timothy Root, a cambist of Sol 3, that we have priceless specimens of mediums of exchange that the universal credit card has rendered obsolete. In his dealings in alien monies, Timothy Root from time to time came across choice specimens, extracted them, attached them end to end, and, in 2137 UE, left to the Bernard Baroque Museum in Sigma Corvi 4 the renowned Galactic Short Snorter. This is not simply a souvenir of his calling and of the trading and traveling it called for, but because of his practice of writing on the margins of each bill as he acquired it some account of the society in which it functioned, a veritable compendium of the history of economics. Indeed, to appreciate to the full these more or less worn catalysts, one must view them not only as bits of various materials of various sizes, shapes, and colors, but as bits of history. Needless to say, we do not always agree with Timothy Root's evaluations. In fact, we discount many of them. But it is as a trailblazer that we honor him. Inasmuch as the short snorter winds and coils in and out of the 3 large rooms of the museum, we can give only a sampling of its riches here. There is no better item to begin with than A, in the exhibit. This is at once the largest and smallest piece of currency, compensating in size for its minuscule denomination. It is a 1/10 to the 10th power Fudo bill and was in use on Megrez 1 for paying taxes. In 2020 UE, the government there began taxing a person on what he valued himself. Psychiatrists from all over the galaxy flocked there, and the natives flocked to the psychiatrists to achieve feelings of inadequacy. The government made out fairly well on the take from the psychiatrists till the psychiatrists took to going to one another. The Sterope 4 trader who passed on to Timothy Root the next item, B, himself received it as a reward for supplying the authorities misleading information. A guilt-filled Steropian yielded himself up for the killing of a leading citizen. To substantiate his confession, he furnished details only the killer could know. One detail he was unaware of: the state had just emptied the state treasury to build a new treasury building. Knowing a murder trial would cost the state over 1 million lemuk, it had given secret, strict instructions to prevent a trial. The traitor, a brother-in-law of the police commissioner, and incidentally a sub-son-in-law of the builder, came forward and, to the great relief of the state, furnished the self-styled killer with an alibi. C. This charred banknote is a relic of El Kofra 3. Timothy Root came across it with nervous belly, in his words, poking through rubble. The planet was in ruins, but the scattering of starving survivors had one remnant of pride. They had, before the attack by El Kofra 5, succeeded, by cutting defense research spending in balancing the budget. D. A reserve note from Alcyone II. This is little more than play money for second childhood. One result of longer life expectancy was the postponing of inheritance till the heirs were themselves rich in years, and because of welfare benefits in no need of such windfalls, which soon became a mere matter of form. This kind of note came mostly into play in the buying and selling of pasts, contracts for the purchase or sale of produce raised, harvested, delivered, and eaten years before. And this leads us to another example, E, of non-monetary money, the scrip of Maya 5. This is not currency per se, but a symbol of a product that the currency would have bought. This particular civilization was attempting to move from material gain to the purely spiritual. For the benefit of those of its citizens who were still in the intermediate stages, the government printed scrip bearing the names of coveted objects and distributed them free, in lieu of the objects themselves. In accord with its policy of gradually eliminating the main physical stumbling block, the money mart, the government each year took away another exchange seat. The members had to compete physically for the remaining seats. The narrowing group of survivors, striving to stay in condition to maintain their sitting, grew more and more fiercely engrossed with the wholly physical. The last two felt their joint strength was enough to enable them to turn the tables on the government. It was. They pensioned off the deposed leaders with scrip bearing titles of power. F. A non-negotiable instrument from Talitha 9. A suave, persuasive missionary to that planet, hoping a wealthy, elderly native lady would endow his mission, sold her on the transmigration of souls. With unremitting hatred, he listened to the reading of her will. She had left all her money and effects to herself. Her estate has remained intact, as the executors have so far been unable to determine which, if any, of the life forms of Talitha 9 she has come back as. G. This is a replica. The original note vanished in a frightening puff shortly after the transaction in which Timothy Root obtained it. The Electra 7 government designed its money to encourage spending and discourage hoarding. The note bore a printed circuit and a timing device that set off the note at some indeterminate moment within 6 Terran months of issue. Whoever had possession of the note at the time was left with a hole burned in his pocket. H. The opposite extreme, a bill that is practically indestructible. It was in this currency that the government of Alcor III paid off migrant workers who had erected a dome on a new satellite. This payoff resulted in the workers blasting the dome to shards, not out of eagerness for more work in rebuilding the dome, but out of resentment. They had worked to get the money in order to sacrifice it as a burnt offering of the fruit of their labors. Alcor III made a hasty deal for the fulminating Electra 7 money, and the migrant workers rebuilt the dome. The money went off just before the dome was finished, and they blew it up again. I. A banknote from Aldebaran 1. The luminosity of the money rubs off. The richer the person, the more he glowed. Naturally, to preserve this distinction of status, the government had to lay down restrictions on the passing of notes. For example, tellers and clerks were not allowed to handle money. From Merope 1 comes Exhibit J. As automation and specialization more and more removed the sense of actually having to do with production, people of this planet grew more and more uneasy. They found it hard to justify their economic upkeep, to give people the feeling that they were really earning the money the government turned out its notes in the form of a jigsaw puzzle. One had to piece it together before it could be banked or spent. This worked for a time, but the notes had to become increasingly difficult to assemble to make an acceptable work week. This specimen is one of the last notes issued. A piece is missing. This is not owing to any slip-up on the part of Timothy Root. It was a deliberate omission, a shameful, debasing device of the government's to put off the final reckoning, which came a week later. Origins of Galactic Fruit Salad. Miles of glorious braid lead back to 3030 UE, when the Galactic Council charged the Galactic Core with the mission of lessening aggression on planets in advance of overt contact by the diplomatic service. It is with deepest reverence that one taps the archives of the Awards and Decorations Board of the Galactic Core. In them, one finds the notable recipients of the various medals that came into being with that directive. Distinguished Conduct Cornet, cast in gold and radium, obverse comet approaching perihelion, reverse comet receding. Orbiting Porrima 5, Warrant Officer Uvru Vroglu found tribal battle impending between the Luau and the Jahali. Projection showed the invading Luau would win, giving a warlike cast to the planet's future culture. In full view of the Jahali, the Luau warlock prepared to foretell victory. He set out hatchet-berry droops in simulated battle formation, unpatriotically arranging the juicier to represent the Jahali, then confidently bent his neck to his chief's blade. Birds cuneiformed out of the sky. Their cropping would indicate the casualties. Displaying amazing accuracy, W.O. Vroglu played his vibro gun over the droops and caused the birds to be eerily selective. They could make off with only the droops representing the two chiefs. The Luau chief regained his equilibrium and easily convinced the Jahali chief the Luau had come on a peaceful trading expedition. Distinguished Service Pin. Plastic, shot through with silicon and titanium. On Izar II, through the ages, contesting armies had trampled what had once been rank borderland to dust. Neither side wanted it any more. Still, it knew unhappy disposition of troops, the armies of Edin and Emik facing each other across desolation, both longing to about-face, neither willing to pull back with the other in view. A heat wave was due. Tempers would fray. The orbiting observer, spaceman First Class Roby Ludnurk, took a calculated risk to avert the fray. He deliberately induced a highly localized heat wave. Demonstrating unusual skill in fire control, Suffolk Ludnurk drew both vibro guns and heated a thin layer of air above the ground each army stood, reflecting light rays upward. Each army, recovering from a long moment of dazzle, saw ahead only glassy shimmering as though the other had flooded the land to deny it to the enemy. Each about-faced and marched home. General Service Arrow. Shaft, longbow, made of branch, olive, and feather, dove. Chief Petty Officer Satim Lidvo, observing Tien Kuan II, found two powers, Zeban and Kruna, anxious for their latest quarrel to come to a head. They were waiting for the people of the other great power of the planet, Vozil, to rebuild. It had always been their practice that two warring powers took turns clobbering a third party, the winner being the one inflicting the heavier damage. But the Vozin, weary of war, were dragging their feet. Zeban and Kruna besieged Vozil with reconstruction funds. The Vozin weakened. They pocketed much of the largesse, but ultimately began to rebuild. Exhibiting unusual initiative, CPO Lidvo plied his vibrogun to shiver their timbers, destroying by night what the Vozin built by day. Zeban and Kruna sent Vozil bluff notes threatening war unless Vozil stopped sabotaging the war effort. Zeban naming the neighboring land of Unzarg as the proving ground in its quarrel with Vozil and Kruna, nominating Bugin. The Vozin, unable to stop, bravely took up both challenges. But Zeban and Kruna were only bluffing. Through his intelligent dissipation of their grants, CPO Lidvo had deflated their war chests. Psych War Award. Protactinium, shielded. Obverse Freud couchant. Reverse Sphinx dormant. Nose riddled. At the time of the coal sack emergency, the Galactic Corps had recalled psychosemanticist Ira Kroh to active duty for the duration. At GHQ, a buck slip fluttered out the window in the paper blizzard attending the victory parade. The slip chanced to be his orders. Therefore, Ensign Kroh remained manning a POW-less interrogation depot on an asteroid in the region of Sagittarius. He kept up his morale by giving himself orientation lectures and by maintaining alertness and discipline. After uneventful years, he spotted symptoms of war pathology on Rukbat 3. His scout ship sat only meters away, but he had confined himself to quarters. He opened sealed orders for such an exigency and read, "Do your best." He policed up a paper blizzard and sentenced himself to additional confinement. By tampering with the gravastat that maintained comfortable artificial gravity, he wrenched the asteroid, losing the ship in the process, and headed quarters and all toward Rukbat 3. There the war had ended. Dictator Sedao, having won this plum, in savoring it, forgot he had been eager to throw down the gauge to other lands. But a portent, the sudden appearance of a heavenly body, reawakened him to his dream of glory. While Ensign Crow fretted in the firmament at the necessarily slow deceleration approach, Sedao's army headed north-northwest to erupt through unguarded badlands. Crow anticipated their line of march. With cool disregard of personal safety, he set the asteroid down. The vanguard of the invading army came upon a building on a hill, stormed it, and Sedao entered Ensign Crow's quarters. Ensign Crow explained that this was a sanitarium. By nightfall, the portent having vanished from the firmament, Ensign Crow had convinced Sedao that he, Sedao, was a paranoiac who only thought he was the great Sedao. Sedao disbanded his imaginary army and committed himself. When Ensign Crow had packed in his own time, he stepped outside and sent up a space flare, only to run into charges of desertion. The oversight caused by the loss of his orders had righted itself, and his relief had come to find the post missing. But that, too, righted itself in time, and Ensign Crow received this award posthumously. Vermilion Ilion, cast in yttrium and sodium. Troy, towers of, topless, with horse, wooden, at gates of. With only a graviray ring, Corporal Sally Sims landed on Alpharats 7 and, posing as a trader, made her way along the Yila River to the city of Ut. Forces from Viut would soon besiege Ut, and Corporal Sims had to bring about a stalemate. Using her graviray to tip the scales, she amassed enough to purchase a tavern for cover. The no trust sign over the bar was sinisterly appropriate. By now, Viut had invested Ut, and every friend might be foe. Aid from Dulk, an ally of Ut, seemed a forlorn hope. Despite taunts from Ut women who were unconscious fifth columnists, the besiegers let attrition and rumor do their work. Then, one night, provisioners from Dulk pulled up the Yila. They clung to the walls of Ut and clamored quietly for the water gate to open before Viut soldiers upstream in ambush, expecting relief to drift down into crossfire, got wind and arrived. Ut wakened. The fifth column blocked off the Watergate mechanism, the sixth column attacked the fifth, the seventh tore the great cannon from its embrasure and rounded it on the sixth. Corporal Sims sprang into action. She locked her cash box and called Nitam, her tapster, to follow her to join the eighth column. She had used her wiles to win Nitam's loyalty against the moment of need. Loud clamoring spurred the eighth on to win. Corporal Sims and the other survivors drew Fallen out of the way to round the cannon on the gate and so finesse the fifth. But Nitnam, unmasking himself as a ninth columnist, leaped to the breach. Corporal Sims advanced alone, trusting to Nitam's love. A near miss. Nitam quickly reloaded. Corporal Sims, with a prayerful gesture, set her grav-array to give extreme weight to the shell. Nitam fired. The shell remained in place an instant, then dropped. The gun itself shot backward and breached the Watergate. The relief party poured in. Order of persistence. Plastic. Teeth. Set. Major Reggie Nulzo, observing Sirius 1, dog-eared his telemark of Bull Run and broke out his weapons. A peace mission from Jodlu was nearing the bridge to Pudra. On the Pudra side, the jingoist CO of the border watchtower planned to blow up the bridge in the teeth of the peace mission. Once the Jodlu envoys crossed safely, the danger would pass, for a Pudra escort waited to whisk them to the capital to finalize an immediate mutual pullback. Major Nulzo tried to lift away the powder charge under the bridge or shake loose the wiring, but he had failed to keep his grav-array and vibro gun in working order, or else they were lemons to begin with. Undaunted, Major Nulzo landed his scout craft in woods nearby. He stripped and crept toward the stream. Before he could plunge in to disarm the charge, a Pudran sentry halted him with a shout. To Major Nulzo's horror, the sentry patted his flank. The Pudran had taken him for an ovbuk, an animal that made a fine mascot, and was sentimentally protecting him from the charge, rather than vice versa. Pudran troops to a man were near-sighted, as befitted a tradition of coming to grips with the foe. Balked, Major Nulzo padded into the watchtower in time to hear the CO give the order to detonate. A yeoman poised a finger over a button while the order passed down the chain of command. Major Nulzo slowed the order by distracting the officers with moist friendliness, but the order came down inexorably. It reached the yeoman's immediate superior. The envoys were on the bridge. Major Nulzo, resolute in this extremity, bit the yeoman's finger. Nursing it, the yeoman looked helplessly from his other digits to the button while the mission crossed safely. Brevet ribbon. Sodium bicarbonate spectrum. Mess Sergeant Veg Tvekvi, hopping his field kitchen from outpost to outpost, was the nearest corpsman when the Botin 2 emergency came up. The sector computer called on him. Though he had none of the conventional weapons at his disposal, Sergeant Tvekvi touched Kepi and changed course. Fields fattened and bins bulged in Potmu, but the populace was not content. The gnashing of irredentists was heard in the land. Potmu expansionists demanded collops out of neighboring lands under the pretext of errors of marking. Some faulty registration of map colors blurred the borders. The government set up conscription. The conscripts accepted their lot, theirs but to bow and obey. They were even now on menacing maneuvers. Sergeant Tvekvi digested all this and drew up a plan of rumble. He passed up meals till hunger pangs had grown severe, then opened a ration pack. He sniffed ravenously. He set it aside. The pangs grew almost unbearable. Making do with regulation mess equipment, he tapped his veins, isolated the hunger hormone from his blood, and placed it in a protein reproducer. Even as it was synthesizing in quantity, the expansionist leaders were issuing marching orders. The troops bowed snappily. Then, while the leaders looked on much moved, the men made for a thorny thicket through which a trail twisted toward neighboring Vatnobg. Sergeant Tvekvi hurriedly injected hormone into aerosol cans. Hovering unseen, thanks to a spatter of food colors with which he camouflaged his craft, he sent down a mist that clung to the barbed growth. When the column was well in, he tossed an economy-sized package of self-hydrating greens to obliterate the trail. Lost, the troops tore out of the inoculating thicket and found themselves embarking on a mad foraging over the fields of Potmu. By the time the leaders caught up with them, the troops, looking a ragged but gluttonous rabble, had gorged themselves too obese to do obeisance. This insubordination proved as demoralizing to the leaders as to the conscripts themselves. The expansionist government forgot the casus belli and fell in its haste to demobilize. Meanwhile, Sergeant Tvekvi had dutifully stuffed himself against having to inoculate the troops with his satiation hormone. He feared they would strip the fields and empty the bins, then turn again toward Vatnobg. But the hunger hormone had spent its force, and they returned home peaceably. Refraining from action metal. Cast in calcium and lithium. Palm. Preventive. Petty Officer Dexter Murray put in for transfer to straight duty, but drew Aspidisc 5, notoriously pacific. Languishing in his vigil, he glowed to see Epshmen in armor descend upon Alodznigriv. He prepared to distinguish himself, then found those of Epshis were merely trooping in for annual servicing of their ceremonial armor, which the armorers of Alodznigriv took care would not articulate a blow. He went back to his vigil. After a time, he glowed to see armies assemble in Gilev and in Mirj, receive an issue of blades, and march head-on. He prepared to distinguish himself, then watched each force simply prune its side of the boundary hedge. He went back to his vigil. When his tour of duty was nearly up, he glowed to hear alarms of war. And in the most lethargic area of Aspidisc 5, along the Fablaics-Laxelfa border, there was no trespass as yet. Constant watch had begun, however, with a frenzy of build-up, but he saw with misgivings the two chiefs of state secretly rendezvous. He listened in and knew joy. They were planning not to ease tension, but to further it. Here was his chance to punish dishonor and distinguish himself. His finger moved to a trigger, but he chose to savor the moment, and he heard them, in breaking up the parley, remind each other of their aim and of the need to stand fast. In both Fablaics and Lehexapha, much had long wanted doing, but sense of urgency had faded and gathered smell of must. Now their economies were rolling along on bogies of war, e.g., under guise of bringing up fill for potential crump holes. They were building roads their forerunners had planned but never begun for lack of funds. P.O. Murray went back to his vigil. Meritorious Service Ribbon. Mica, with embeddings of beryllium and lithium constellating a Milky Way, W-H-E-Y. W.O.J.G. Hasnut saw war threaten all Akrux 20 because one Uvjavikuj, wishing to get rid safely of one Sarado, his rival in love, planned to trick their nation into war and send Sarado to the most dangerous front. Having charge of the government computer, Uvjavikuj set it to misinterpreting findings so that preventive war seemed in the cards, and to foretelling the most dangerous front so that it might cut orders sending Sarado there. W.O. Hasnut, demonstrating superb remotemanship, beamed his gravi-ray to weight the statistics Uvjevicic fed into the crude computer Acrox 20 was conversant with. This created a lag, enabling W.O. Hasnut's own advanced model to advise him how best to joggle the bits of information with his vibro gun. Uvjevicic, finding that whatever action Serrato might figure in, he was bound to reap not death but glory, had his computer predict the country would lose the war and recommend preventing its start. Origins of Galactic Philosophy. On 300 Day, 4004 UE, the Radiation Disposal Corporation's space tug Uebuk, Sirius 1 Registry, was in deep space jettisoning radioactive wastes. It was engaging in the questionable practice of dumping the stuff in packets at meaningful intervals. Captain Goshal Ravwaimu, as he tells us in his unblushing memoirs, My 9 Lives, having accepted an under-the-table proposition. These faint chalkings on the blackboard of nothingness were to spell out in dots of computer Morse a subliminal message urging prospects to buy SHUV transmutating metal polish. I wouldn't give a plugged die-saw for a shipload of SHUV, the captain tells us. But this was his first dealing with the mighty Ad Astra agency, which handled the SHUV account, and he meant to turn in a neat job. The craft was parsecs out in reaches where the pull of stars would not blur the message, but when Goshal took off his captain cap and put on his astrogator cap, he spotted at once that line of message was bellying out of true. He traced the influence to an asteroid where no asteroid should be. He put on his captain cap and ordered the launch out to investigate. The launch sniffed around and determined that under the encrusting and pitting the object was no asteroid, but a vast ship. The launch matched the spin of the ship, clanged airlock to airlock, and knocked. The tapping evoked no response. Sensing Captain Goshal on remote breathing down its eye, the launch forced the spaceship's lock. It poked its scanner down a dusty passage. It found no sign of sentient life, but found in its sampling of hydroponics-fed air no danger to life. Captain Goshal thought salvage, and his mind teemed with astronomical figures. He recalled the launch, put on his boarding party cap, strapped on his freezer, and sent himself to the derelict. The air seemed moldy, but he let his chest inflate. Now and again he had to back through a creeping of hydroponics jungle, but deck after deck was jammed full of perfectly sound equipment. Out of date, of course, but there were a myriad primitive planets to unload it on. After a particularly ferocious snarl of jungle, he was glad to come on a smile of clearing. A park, he guessed, for beside a bench-rimmed, dust-covered pool stood what he saw as a surrealistic statue. He laughed. "I wonder what you stand for," he said, and switched on his non-wipe time stream tape to record his claim to the ship. He froze. He thought he had heard a voice saying, "I stand for the purpose of greeting you. That and nothing more." The statue was moving squeakily. Not a statue, but a robot. Goshal's hand shot casually to his freezer. If he had heard aright, the robot knew lingua galactica. "Hello there. I am—" "Yes, I see you. Therefore you are—" Captain Goshal didn't like this talk from robots. "Where's your master?" "Determinism is all about us." Goshal glanced uneasily around. He looked more closely at the robot. There was no expression to read, but the left eye seemed remarkably real. With a chill of insight, Captain Goshal had a vision of a knight in armor. "You mean there's someone inside you? I mean, you're inside that?" The robot tapped itself, had a spell of coughing, then said, "In a material sense, this is me. I'm Lutil. I came into being, flesh and blood being, on Atik 1. I'm one of the last surviving members of the SMP detachment." Captain Gauchal introduced himself, then said, "What happened to the others?" "Time. Come, I'll show you." Lutil started down a spongy path. Captain Gauchal followed down a companionway. Lutil indicated cubicles. "Observe. Here, in what we liked to term our logic-tight compartments, we lived and contemplated, separately concentrating." He stopped suddenly. Captain Gauchal stopped and looked around, hand on freezer. "Or should I say, concentrating separately?" He got underway again. "We're coming to the premises for female aides." Captain Gauchal reached for his boarding party cap to give it an elbow brushing and discovered that in his initial excitement back aboard the Oabuk, he had forgotten to remove his astrogator and captain caps, but they were moving past tenantless rooms. Another companionway brought them to a compartment containing a bulkhead-to-bulkhead computer. "Observe." They stood watching its crystals pulse feebly. "Very nice," Captain Gauchal said at last. "But where are the other survivors?" Lutil patted the computer. "This is the other survivor." The crystals brightened. "Hello, Lutil. Say, I've hit on 4 identical bars in Verdi's Otello, a Dwenalep commercial, and Gounod's Romeo et Juliet." Lutil patted the computer. "Fine, fine." He touched Captain Gauchal's arm. When they were out of photoelectric shot, Lutil said, "Poor thing. We tried musical therapy. Now all it does is that sort of business." "Oh?" "Yes, we asked too much of it, but it was no more than we asked of ourselves. To you it may seem vanity, but our aim was nothing less than to grasp the universe whole. Is this my compartment?" They had returned to the cubicles, and Lutil ushered Gauchal into one and gestured him to a chair. "It makes no difference now. I was saying, we philosophers of the various worlds agreed on one thing, that different points of view led to different images of the structure of reality. We sought a unifying vision, hoping to obtain a functional view of reality, to accomplish collectively what we could not attain individually in the turbulence of life. We planned a symposium on metagalactic philosophy. With backing from foundations, we bought and equipped this spaceship and hired maintenance personnel. This was to be our ivory tower, a place where, away from the violence and corruption, we could placidly deliberate. Beginning circa 2000 UE, the SMP ship planet-hopped, gathering savants. I myself came aboard in 2085. Lutil was pacing. Captain Gauchal saw that over the centuries Lutil had paced grooves of thought in the flooring. The span of years, 2085 to 4004, suddenly struck him. "How do you account for your senior citizenship?" "By the fact that it is not quite my own." "You've lost me." "I see you, albeit blurredly, so I take that to be an idiom expressing perplexity." "Yeah." "Well, then the others of the contingent knew me to be the last surviving adherent of the observationist school. I maintained nothing can exist unless there's an observer to observe it. In spite of their disbelief, everyone was most kind to me. They did their utmost to prolong my existence, giving me first draw on the SMP's Mechanatomical Prosthetics Bank. As you see, I'm largely patchwork. I believe it was for my sake, to strengthen my belief, rather than as a self-preservative measure on their part, that they did this. If so, it's sufficient reason to feel grateful that they haven't lived to learn I've grown zeal-proof, doctrine-proof, and ultimately almost, he curtailed a cynical laugh, proof-proof. Inwardly, Captain, I am smiling bitterly. You were saying? Oh, yes. About the ingathering, it was not without misadventure. I am in mind of Ojuras, the renowned promulgator of up-spiraling awareness. The SMP ship put in at Svati 1 to pick up Ojuras. The registrar at first thought Ojuras was a no-show. She got no response when she called Ojuras's home. On an off chance, she searched the ship itself. In the hold, atop a heap of Ojuras's effects, a portly Svatyai sat, amid the clangor and turmoil of servicing, loading, and refueling, with eyes closed as in deep meditation. Smiling, the registrar trundled him bodily to the assigned cubicle. Falirj wakened from a dream of repast. Through the port he saw stars. He sprang to his feet. The door opened, and a serving tray wheeled itself in and arranged itself temptingly. A lesser being, without stopping to think, might have opened his mouth to shout his identity. It should not be too late to shoot him home. Falirj opened his mouth to devour the meal. The registrar followed, hastily informed Falirj she wasn't the dessert, and asked if he were comfortable. Falirj was already nodding off. Pleased, the registrar tiptoed out and left the savant to his meditating. When next Falirj wakened, a welcoming delegation was waiting on him. Falirj looked about at a wisp of beards, a field day for Occam's razor, and his heart failed him. He started to tell them he was not the person they thought him. Their head silenced him. Sat. Rang. A banquet table entered. Falirj found it useless, with his mouth full, to protest. They thought he was being modest. They presented him with the SMP insignia, glasses to wear pushed up on the brow, speeches. When next he wakened, he found himself alone. He shuddered to think what the effect would be on their feelings when they learned he wasn't the great Ojuras. His serving tray wheeled in, so it went. Now and again a savant had the wish to consult him on finer points of his forte, but the others looked daggers of the mind at any who would disturb the great Ojuras, and so, save for his own profound snoring, an almost tangible hush insulated Falirj. Some thought they saw what the great Ojuras was getting at, ultimate awareness. His very example was a teaching that sleep, instead of being a mere means of restoring vitality to the individual, was an end. Dreams were the real life, whereas most mortals compromise their dreams in order to meet the realities. The indomitable Ojuras compromised reality in order to meet his dream. His strict observance of his discipline won many philosophers over to his doctrine, though none could excel him by the time the ship stationed itself hereabouts. And when, in fullness of time, he went to his eternal dream, his name carried glory, even after it came out that he was Falirj, a porter, as it did when the ship received a plaintive message from the true Ojuras, who, concentrating on being aware, on being aware of being aware, on being aware of being aware of being aware, and so on, had been unaware till too late that the ship had long since arrived and departed. Captain Gauchal stood up. Now that he knew the ship was not a derelict, ending all hope of salvage, there seemed no percentage in remaining aboard. Speaking of going, yes, Captain, dear old Falirge was not the first to go. That was the distinguished philosopher Oxnovomri, intentional entropist of Alcyone 4. How often I saw this paratoid run screaming through the ship, terrified by the ultimate annihilation of space-time. At length it collapsed of exhaustion, but Oxnovomri did not die of exhaustion. While the paratoid was recuperating, the medical officer found a throbbing cyst on its person. The medical officer prepared to excise it. The cyst grew strangely calm, as though watching with detached interest its own impending doom. After the operation, the paratoid resumed its running about with all its old vigor. It screamed the same warning, but it was not the same. And then we learned philosopher Oxnovomri had been the cyst. It came of a parasitic line, each being essentially a when-on and using the vocal apparatus of its host paratoid. Captain Gauchal edged away. Lutil took his arm. "Shall we stretch our legs?" "No, not that way. I don't want to set the poor computer off again. Oh, forgive me. You're no doubt impatient to hear what set it off in the first place. It's gestalt-oriented, you know, trained to discover similarities, analogies in masses of data, to correlate cycles, and the like. With its help, we hoped to achieve our unifying vision. Each of us philosophers reduced his theory to holes punched in tape. The computer swallowed all of this. We then fed it the basis theorem and the decomposition theorem for ideals of a cumulative field with ascending chain condition. We crowded around, watching the pulsing. Chill of anticipation. We knew the computer should be able to comprehend the universe as a single coherent function. We stared. We knew it had the answer. We asked it to tell us. We moved to answer. Then we saw it was mad, quite mad. After that, most of us resigned ourselves to the reality that in the last analysis, the real is unrealizable. Oh, but not Kozomek. Kozomek of Anonymous. I was the father of fixed introspectionism. I can see him now, discoursing, turning his eye patches on his hearers. Finite mind can't cope with infinite universe? Can. Kozomek believed the world of perception, the internal world of the mind, was not simply a correlate of the external world, but was part of the external world. He believed any sampling of the universe would give insight into the essential nature of the whole. He believed it followed that his mind would reflect not merely subjectively but also objectively the reality of nature. And so Kozomek turned his mind's eye in upon itself. At last, in fear and trembling, he announced he could see the universe steady and see it whole. He would map it for us. We crowded around Kozomek and watched while he traced his inner vision on 3D paper. Finally, he let his pen drop and fell back faint. We stared, amazed. Was that what the continuum came to in the end? It had a spongy look. One likened it to moss. A closer look showed it to be replete with folds, seeming to give substance to ancient conjectures of time and or space warps. Then one diffidently mentioned the thought it had much the aspect of a nerve ganglion, and at that we saw it steady and saw it whole. We saw it as the concatenation of Kozomek's own brain cells. Whether or not it was in reaction to this, many turned to the quest of unreality. Camestress of Sol, too, loudly demanded that we condense the ship's atmosphere to thick fog to give an air of unreality to the place. Wiser lungs prevailed. The problem remained. Where does truth lie? The cold light of reason should have helped to determine that, but as the computer and Kozomek both had shown, the cold light of reason was as the light of a dead star. My adherence to observationism began to weaken. If the universe began to take on a new look at about that time, perhaps it was not simply because I was seeing it with a new eye. At many a get-together over our cups, we sought the solution, the animating principle, with such good fellowship and such careful and precise talk, that we often thought we had found the answer. It would be later, when we listened soberly to the playback of our discussion, that we would realize what we had taken for meaningful universals were drunken maunderings. Lutil turned away, but not before Captain Gauchal saw the start of a tear at the right eye. Now, I am not sure that we were not closer to the true spirit, but at the time I agreed with the majority that reason must prevail. Among the measures we took to minimize the possibility of irrational thinking was that of putting up a shield against cosmic rays. This because of the assumption that their bombarding touched off random thoughts and actions. This had to overcome fierce opposition from Dual Eglan of Baid 1. Dual nominally held to the meaningful maxim of the ambiguous school. Nothing is meaningless. None of the ambiguists would or could give a straight answer as to its meaning. To me, it implies that any meaningless noise is potentially meaningful, just as weeds are plants whose virtues have not yet been discovered. I am not sure whether Dual himself took it as stating the rationality of the absurd or, contrariwise, the absurdity of the rational. At any rate, he appeared to believe that in an infinity of universes there must be a universe without purpose, and he seemed to have concluded that from an empirical point of view this was it. Ever since I had known Dual, which was ever since he had come aboard, he had deliberately spoken gibberish. I inferred that he aimed at all costs to avoid meaning, that he hoped thereby to come nearer apprehending this absurd bit of space-time. At first mention of the proposal to screen out the bombarding rays, Dual went around muttering his usual deliberate nonsense with extra emphasis. Uzul. As the proposal gained in favor, his nonsense gained in fervor. Za, zek, ins. You will forgive possible distortions in my rendering? As he strove never to repeat himself, his was no mean feat. He must have known better than we the danger he ran of finding himself out of nonsense. But he muttered bravely, tu tik, diu, and some of us wavered. The staunchest of us looked desperately for signs that Dual was nearing the end, signs of logical rigor, but he had nonsense in reserve. Otif, was his last trumpet call. It was clear that if he spoke he would have to speak meaningfully. Frustration struck him speechless, and his naysaying had to manifest itself in glaring. That, no doubt, hastened his end. I am sure it would have pleased him that, owing to some malfunctioning of thrust, the coffin rocket headed his corpse toward an antimatter galaxy. The clearing. They had come full circle. Gauchal, with a sigh, forbore to protest as Lutil seated him beside the pool. Lutil bent to pluck a butterwort, then had compunction and straightened stiffly. "Oh, vanity, vanity! With your sigh, Captain, you have expressed it admirably, beyond the power of words." He gazed into the pool. "Ah, yes. By this pool, the psychosocial philosopher Gurdjieff of Dalim I spent years meditating on the best way of conducting one's life. For the better part of those years he never lost sight of his objective. He kept his thoughts moving in a virtuous circle. Then unrest beset him. Although he kept brushing the thought away, it came back, nagging him that he had forgotten something vital that he should have remembered. One ship's day, for the exercise, he made for the stockroom instead of dialing his want. Pigeonholes, reigning categorists and dogmatists, titanic Teutonic piling up of reference materials. He was lost. Then he saw Rai, the supply clerk, moving supply toward him through the stacks. He told her he was looking for categorical imperatives. Vivaciously, Rai set about helping him hunt. After a vigorous but vain while, he said, "You do know what I mean?" Rai said, "To be honest, I don't." And she laughed gaily. "Let's be honest, after all, shall we?" Shaken by he knew not what wind of emotion, Gurdjieff grabbed a microvolume at random, smiled his thanks, and returned here. He sat down to meditate. His thoughts strayed, and he brought them back to the fold with difficulty. Abstractedly he smoothed his elliptical mustache. He found himself gazing into the pool. He saw with a shock how gray his hair had grown. That evening he proposed to Rai, and she, loving impulsiveness, accepted, and so they affared. They had 7 charming girls. Indeed, all offspring aboard ship were females. When it was too late to test, the theory occurred to us that screening out cosmic rays might have engendered this state of affairs. In any case, this factor and the prevalence of platonic love were the major reasons for the dying out of SMP. Of course, all was not platonic love. Of course, all was not harmony. Of course, there were disputes. I am smiling inwardly, Captain, as one such comes to mind. In this corner was the gymnosophist, Frisian of Chara III. His method of philosophizing was to contort his face and furrow his brow in imitation of thinking, on James's principle that emotion follows bodily change. In the other corner was the biliarist de Sulrul of Gomeza II. Her method of philosophizing was to furrow her brow and contort her face in outward expression of inward struggle. They clashed not on the issue of whether thought was a mode of emotional disturbance, but on which came first, appearance or reality. When I attempted to bring this to their attention, both turned on me, and I desisted. Though their confrontations appeared extremely fierce, the discussion between them never grew heated. Indeed, on the principle that hate is akin to love, they set up housekeeping together. From Tegmine 9 came another couple, though whether loving or hating I never knew, Uwain and his mate Ymir. Projective Stoics, each watched to see if the other was failing to bear up under pain or pleasure, but never once did either's face give anything away. At the banquet celebrating their 59th mating anniversary, each extolled the other in measured terms, for nothing had moved either, not fear, rage, jealousy, lust, revenge, love, hatred. It was a moving occasion, but neither showed signs of emotion, till, proud of having stifled her feelings for so long, Ymir involuntarily gave a groan of pleasure. She clapped her hands to her mouth, and her face teetered on the fulcrum of nose, disclosing that she wore a mask. In putting his hands protectively over his face, Uaim unmasked himself. Having lost face, neither could bear to meet the other again. Now I am frowning sadly, Captain, for I call to mind another contretemps which had truly serious consequences, a shocking event, terrible at the time, and disturbing even to recall. If you'd rather not, it involved, on the one hand, Fwisdan Wushtarok of Pollux I. Owing to the pervasive luminosity of his home planet, all substance there was without shadow. This gave rise to a sense of unsubstantiality. Fwislan Wushtarok's interstitch philosophy epitomized this worldview. I can sum up his philosophy by saying that he held all nets are as much complexes of knots, N-O-T-S, as of knots, K-N-O-T-S. His doctrine called for at once countering a positive statement with its negative, and on the other hand it involved Radu of Nodus Secundus 9. At first meeting and for some time thereafter, old Fwislan Wushtarok thought Radu was of a mind with him. The excessive libration of Radu's home planet induced a permanent wobbling in the inhabitants, not noticeable till they left the planet. When Radu came aboard, his way of shaking no and saying yes, and vice versa, at once warmed Fwislan Wushtarok to him. But this wobbling couldn't have been more misleading. Radu couldn't stand ambiguity. He was partial to the all-inclusive. Fwislan Wushtarok would say, the obsolete absolute presupposes a fixed indeterminacy, or something to that effect, and that would cause Radu to catch him up, saying, "But now you're contradicting yourself." And Fwislan Wushtarok, thinking Radu was nodding approvingly, would say, "I thank you." And if Radu had not been wobbling, he would have been trembling with fury. But once the venerable Fwislan Wushtarok learned that every nod was part of an all-inclusive repudiating, the fury was all his. The sage mustered his strength, took up a bust of Plato, and, wielding it as a mace, came at Radu. Radu's wobbling frustrated Fwislan Wushtarok, who sought to pepper Radu with blows but landed not one. Further hampering Fwislan Wushtarok was the fact that his SMP insignia slipped down his brow and covered his eyes. The assault flailed on, but Radu was safe so long as he made no move. But when, through failure of nerve, or through seeking to get in a gingerly lick of his own, he made a move, the backswing of a blow Fwislan Wushtarok had aimed at his own shadow clove Radu's skull. It quickly proved the end for both. As Fwislan Wushtarok bent mourning over his dead foe, he, too, received a fatal blow. Radu had lashed out in tricky rigor mortis. There's an important issue here. You're not to confuse Fwislan Wushtarok's doctrine with the 180-degreeism of Zweipals, the preeminent vectorist of Wasat III. Zweipals, knowing his disciples would distort his teachings, taught the opposite of what he actually believed and wanted. No, I mean, yes. Looking back, Captain, I feel much as Spage must have felt. He was the supreme exponent of retrogradism, you know. As he would say, a fly in amber can't. This was his way of declaring that to comprehend the present, which in his view was a synthesis of past and future, it was necessary to wait till it was past. Retrogradism itself was an outgrowth of quotidianism, as an antidote to giving way to a sense of crisis and foreboding. The quotidianists read the paper daily, but it was the paper of that day of a preceding year, all the crises of the year before having resolved themselves one way or the other. Spage came aboard with microfiles of Dalim 1 newspapers spanning the past 10 years and with a mind blank to the happenings of those years. He began his studies. He rigidly refrained from peeking ahead. To back his won't power, the tamper-proof viewer would not advance faster than the regulation issue per day. So it went. Then tragedy threatened. You no doubt recall the disaster that befell Spage's home planet. So naturally no new issues would be forthcoming. We shrank from thought of telling Spage, and equally from thought of letting him learn abruptly. Meanwhile, the microfiles were running out. Nearing the issue of the day, Spage left home for the SMP ship. The supplement to bring him up to antedate did not, and would not, arrive. While we were wondering what to do, the viewer, with its built-in dread of idleness, took it on itself to splice the end of the last issue to the beginning of the first. Those of us in the know held our breath, hoping Spage wouldn't jump on encountering the abrupt transition. He did jump. But for joy, the return of the good old days confirmed his second-guessing that history ran in cycles. Oh, to think we dreamed of becoming the Platonic essence of philosophy, the eternal philosophy in heaven, vanity. Lutil squeaked to an edge of the clearing and several steps through underbrush. He swept growth aside to uncover a port. He stared out, gazing thoughtfully at space-time and at his own image faintly imposed on it. Captain Gauchal started. Not only no salvage here, but he now saw he had wastefully left the precious non-wipe time-stream tape, on which he had meant to stake his claim to the derelict, running all along. He would have hurled his caps down and jumped on them, his way of taking it philosophically, if Lutil's thoughtful stance had not shamed him. Later, Captain Gauchal was to splice this interview in his memoirs, and so give our present-day philosophers to think. But at the moment his only thought was to make up for lost space-time. "Nice talking to you, but I've got to go." He made as if to return to the Oebook. Lutil coughed. He rubbed a discolored metallic jaw awkwardly. Captain Gauchal stopped. "Yes?" "I wonder if you know where I can get some chouve." You've been listening to pre-1990s speculative fiction readings with a highlight on science fiction by Darrell T. Smith II. Please consider clicking the donation link in the description box. Thank you so much for your time and your imagination.